Hey there and welcome back. Settle yourself down now, as deep and as easy as you can manage, and let the day slip away from you, for it is finished and there is nothing left in it that has any further claim on you tonight. Wherever you are, and whatever kind of day has carried you here to this quiet hour, you are welcome, and there is nothing left to do but let your breath go slow and let yourself be carried somewhere far away. Tonight I want to take you back to the spring of 1912 and out onto the wide grey water of the North Atlantic, aboard the most beautiful and most talked about ship that had ever been built by the hand of man, the Titanic. She was a floating palace of glass and gilding and polished oak, so vast and so splendid that the people who walked her decks could hardly believe that she was real. She held every luxury the age could dream of, and a few it had never dreamed of before, and she carried that spring some of the richest and most celebrated people afloat, all of them caught up in the glamour and the wonder of her first voyage. And before this evening is over, you and I will dine at the finest table afloat, and stand beneath a dome of iron and glass at the head of a staircase that had no equal on land or on sea, and watch the wealthiest man in all America come quietly down it, in his white tie and tails, to dinner. Before we step aboard, let me say the one detail that belongs to our own time and not to the golden world we are sailing into tonight, and then I will not break the spell again. If these long voyages into vanished ages are a comfort to you, a way of setting the day gently down and drifting off towards sleep, then you would be most welcome to travel with me again on other nights like this one. There is no cost to it, and no hurry, only a standing invitation to slip away from the present whenever the need for it is on you. I like to think of the scattered company that gathers on these evenings, spread as you all are across so many countries and so many different hours of the night. And if you ever care to leave a word telling me which country you are listening from and what the hour has come to where you are, I look through those messages far more often than you might suppose, and there is a quiet and simple warmth in it for me, in knowing a little of who is out there in the dark. Now let us leave our own century behind, and go down to the water, to the greatest ship afloat, waiting at the quay with her lights coming on one by one. Picture this. It is an evening in the spring of 1912, and you are standing on the quayside at Southampton, on the south coast of England, in the last soft light of the day, looking up and up and up, something that does not quite seem possible. Above you rises a wall of black steel, the flank of a ship so enormous that you cannot take her in all at once. You have to move your eyes along her slowly, from the sharp high prow away down the whole immense length of her to the stern, and it is like looking along the side of a cliff, or a street of tall houses laid on its side and set afloat. 4 huge funnels, buff-coloured and banded with black at the top, stand against the evening sky, tall enough that a train could pass through one of them, breathing the faintest haze of warmth into the still air. 10 decks rise one above another, and from 1,000 portholes and windows the electric light is beginning to glow, warm and gold against the gathering dusk, so that the enormous hull seems to hang there in the twilight like a lit city that has somehow floated free of the land. She is brand new, this vessel, so new that the paint has scarcely lost its shine, and there is about her the particular excitement of a thing the world has never seen before, and has come in its thousands to stare at, and can hardly wait to board. She was, quite simply, the largest moving object that human beings had ever made. It is hard now to feel how astonishing that was, for we are used to great machines, but in that spring of 1912 she was a marvel almost past believing, longer than the tallest building of the age was high, weighing more than 50,000 tons, driven by engines the size of houses and boilers as tall as a church, and yet built from end to feel not like a machine at all, but like a palace. That was the wonder of her, and the boast of the line that made her, that a traveller might cross the whole cold width of the Atlantic, and never once feel that he was at sea in a ship, but rather that he was a guest in the grandest hotel on earth, which happened, quietly, to be moving. Her owners had not tried to make her the fastest ship afloat. They had set out instead to make her the largest and the most luxurious, a matter of such comfort and such splendour that the richest people anywhere would cross the ocean in no other way. And in that, beyond any question, they had succeeded. To stand at her rail and look down was to feel a kind of vertigo, for the water was a very long way below, and to look up was to see those 4 enormous funnels leaning against the sky. Only 3 of them in truth did any work, breathing out the smoke of the furnaces far below. The 4th had been added partly for the ventilation of the ship, and partly, one suspects, for the sheer look of her, because 4 funnels seemed grander and safer and more powerful than 3, and this was a ship built above all to be admired. And admired she was. For months the newspapers had been full of her size and her cost and her wonders, and the crowds had come down to the water simply to gaze, and now, on the eve of her first crossing, there hung about her that particular electric excitement that gathers around a thing that is new and famous, and about to begin. There was one detail that everyone who sailed on her remembered ever afterward, and it was not the size, nor the gold, nor the polished wood, but the flowers. She was, some of them said, a ship of flowers. Fresh flowers had been carried aboard in great quantity for the voyage and set in the public rooms and the private suites, in vases and baskets and banks of colour, roses and carnations and lilies and daffodils of the season, so that everywhere you went there was the scent of them, cool and sweet and living, drifting along the carpeted corridors and mingling with the smell of fresh paint and beeswax and cigar smoke. It was a small thing, perhaps, but it was the sort of detail that told you exactly where you were, not on a working ship that smelled of salt and tar and engine oil, but in a floating garden, a warm-scented hotel, where no comfort had been thought too small and no luxury too great, and where everything, down to the last rose in the last vase, had been arranged for the pleasure of the people coming aboard. Before we go further into the night, let us think for a moment of where this ship had come from, of how such a marvel had come to be at all, for she had not sprung into being ready-made. She had been built, slowly and mightily, by the hands of men, in a great shipyard across the sea in Ireland. In the city of Belfast, on the northeastern coast of that green island, there stood one of the greatest shipbuilding yards anywhere, an immense and clangorous kingdom of steel and fire and labour, and it was here, over years of toil, that she had been made. On an enormous slipway, under a towering framework of gantries, thousands of shipyard workers had laboured to raise her, plate by plate and rivet by rivet, from a bare keel laid upon the blocks to the mountain of steel that in time she became. It was work of a hardness and a scale that the pampered passengers could scarcely have imagined. The men of the yard swarmed over her growing hull in their thousands, in every weather riveting and hammering and caulking, the riveters driving home millions of red-hot rivets by hand, 3 million of them and more before she was done, in a din that could be heard across the whole city. Year by year she grew upon her slipway, taller and longer, until she loomed over the streets like a great iron cliff, and the people of Belfast, who had built her and were proud of her as of a child of their own, came down to look at her and marvel. And then, one day she was launched, sent sliding down the greased ways into the water for the first time amid the cheering of a great crowd, floating out onto the river as light as a swan. And after that came the long months of fitting out the building in of all the splendour she would carry, the panelling and the staircases and the staterooms, until the bare hull became the floating palace, and she was ready at last for the sea. There is something worth remembering in that, as we lie in the luxury she carried, that all this beauty and comfort rested, in the end, upon the labour of countless working men, the shipyard hands of Belfast, who had raised her from nothing with their own hard hands, most of whom would never set foot in her fine rooms, nor cross the sea she was built to cross. The millionaire in his silken suite slept, though he never thought of it, within walls that an Irish riveter had bolted together in the rain. The whole glittering marvel had been dreamed by her designers, and then made real by the sweat and skill of thousands of ordinary men. She was, for all her grandeur, a work of human hands, the greatest that those hands had yet achieved, and she carried, built into her very steel, the labour and the pride and the craft of a whole city, out across the sea and into the night. Come with me now, up the gangway and aboard. The first-class passengers came up a covered gangway high on the side of the vessel and stepped in through a doorway in her flank, and the moment they were inside, the sea seemed to vanish, and they might have walked in off a fashionable street into the foyer of a great hotel. There were stewards waiting just within, in the smart livery of the line, who bowed and took your name and your cabin number, and summoned another steward to carry your things and lead you down, and about them was an air of perfect, practiced, unhurried attention, the air of men whose whole art was to make you feel expected and important and entirely at ease. The floor beneath your feet was not the iron deck of a ship, but thick, soft carpet. The walls about you were panelled in gleaming wood. The light was warm and golden, and even from electric lamps in frosted shades, for the ship was lit by electricity, which was still, in those years, a marvel in itself. And there was the warmth, the deep, steady central warmth of the liner, so that you could step in out of the raw evening air of the quayside and feel it wrap around you like a blanket. It took a little while for the newcomer to understand the sheer scale of what he had entered, for a ship this size was a small town, and finding your way about her was a skill that had to be learned. There were miles of corridor, deck upon deck of them, long warm passages carpeted and panelled and lined with the white doors of the staterooms, each with its little brass number, running away farther than the eye could follow. There were staircases, and there were even lifts, elevators of gleaming wrought iron and polished wood that ran silently up and down between the decks, attended by a boy in uniform, so that a lady need not trouble to climb a single stair if she did not wish to. There were signs and there were stewards at every turn to set you right, and there was, near the foot of the staircase, an inquiry office where a clerk would answer any question, and a purser's office where you might lodge your jewels and your money in the safe. For the first hour or two aboard, half the pleasure was simply in the exploring, in wandering the bright warm passages and opening doors upon one wonder after another, and slowly beginning to grasp that you were to live. For the next week, inside the most extraordinary building afloat, and everywhere as you went, there were the small signs of a ship got up for an occasion, the gleam of fresh paint and new brass, the deep pile of carpet that had never been walked on before, the scent of the flowers, the quiet purposeful movement of a small army of stewards and stewardesses making all ready, the distant muffled throb, felt more than heard, of the ship coming alive beneath your feet. Somewhere far below, in a world you would never see, hundreds of men were feeding the furnaces and tending the engines that would drive you over the ocean. But up here, in the warmth and the light and the scent of roses, there was no hint of any of that labour, only ease and comfort, and the growing sense that something wonderful was about to begin. Now let me take you to the very heart of the vessel, to the one place above all others that everyone remembered, the place that was, more than any other, the soul of her splendour, the grand staircase. You came upon it suddenly out of the carpeted passages, and it stopped you where you stood. It rose through 6 decks of the ship, a great sweep of broad shallow oak steps curving down and down beneath you, wide enough for a lady in the fullest gown to descend it like a queen, and it was panelled all around, from top to bottom, in solid oak carved in the rich manner of an old English country house. so that you might have thought yourself in the vast hall of some ancient mansion rather than in a ship at sea. The balustrades were of wrought iron, worked into delicate scrolls and gilded here and there with bronze, and at the foot of them stood a bronze cherub holding up a lamp, its light gleaming softly on the polished wood. It was the most beautiful room ever to go to sea, and everyone who saw it said so. High above the topmost landing there was a dome, a vast dome of wrought iron and glass, and through it, by day, the daylight came pouring down, silvery and shifting, all the long way down the stairwell to the decks below, and by night the dome glowed from within, lit by hidden lamps, so that the whole staircase was bathed in a soft golden radiance from above. And on the uppermost landing, set into the oak panelling, there was a clock, a beautiful carved clock flanked by two bronze figures, allegorical figures of the kind the age loved, meant to represent honour and glory crowning time, and the passengers passing up and down would glance at it to see whether they were late for dinner, never guessing, of course, that a small carved clock upon a staircase would become one of the most famous images on earth. Beneath it, the stair swept down, landing after landing, past the doors of the finest rooms in the vessel, down toward the dining saloon far below. It was here, above all, that the ship displayed herself and displayed her people to one another, for the grand staircase was not merely a way of getting from one deck to another, it was a stage. In the evening, when the bugle had sounded and it was time to go down to dinner, the wealthy and the beautiful would come out of their staterooms in all their finery, the men in black and white, the women in silk and satin and lace, hung with the diamonds and the pearls and the emeralds that were their family fortunes made visible, and they would descend that broad oak stair slowly, gracefully, beneath the glowing dome, past the carved clock and the gilded balustrade, and the little bronze cherub with his lamp, into the warm light and the murmur of the reception room below. To stand at the foot of it and watch them come down was to watch the wealth and the glamour of an entire age go by, a slow procession of everything that money and breeding could make beautiful, framed in carved oak and lit by a dome of glass. And it was, all agreed, a sight not to be seen anywhere else afloat. Let us go now to the staterooms, for you will want to see where you are to sleep, and here too the liner outdid anything that had been seen afloat. The finest first-class accommodation on the Titanic was not a cabin at all in the old sense, not a cramped berth with a porthole, but a suite of rooms, a private apartment, that a duke might have been content to live in ashore. There were bedrooms with proper beds, wide and soft, and made up with fine linen, not the narrow bunks of an ordinary ship. There were sitting rooms with sofas and writing tables and easy chairs drawn up before electric heaters that glowed against the chill of the sea. There were dressing rooms and wardrobe rooms for the mountains of luggage that such people travelled with, and private bathrooms with hot and cold running water, fresh and salt, a luxury almost unheard of at sea. And the strangest and most delightful touch of all was that no two of the finest rooms were alike, for the decorators had fitted them out each in the style of a different age and country, so that a passenger might sleep in a room panelled and furnished in the manner of the France of Louis XIV, all gilt and rose silk, or in the plainer elegance of a Georgian English house, or in the style of Queen Anne, or of the Italian Renaissance, and might cross the corridor to find his friends lodged in another century altogether. Grandest of all were the two great parlour suites, one on either side of the ship, and these were something quite without precedent. Each was a run of several rooms, 2 bedrooms and a sitting room and bathrooms and wardrobe rooms, decorated with the most exquisite care, and each had opening off it its own private promenade deck, a stretch of covered outdoor deck 50 feet long, floored with red tiles and framed with mock timbering in the Old English style, where the occupant might walk in the sea air in perfect privacy, seen by no one, and look out over the water as though from the terrace of his own house. To take such a suite for the crossing cost a sum that would have bought a good house on land, and only a handful of people on earth could have paid it without a thought. But those who could wanted the best, and the best was this. In one of those suites that spring travelled the richest man aboard, and we shall meet him presently. Even the humbler first-class cabins, the single inside rooms with no view of the sea, were finer than the best accommodation on many an older ship, warm and well-fitted and softly carpeted, with a proper bed and a wardrobe and a washstand and the electric light. And there were small touches everywhere that told the passenger he was cared for, a bell to summon a steward or a stewardess at any hour of the day or night, who would bring you tea, or press a gown, or draw a bath, or fetch anything you desired, a cake of the finest scented soap, made specially for the line, laid ready by the basin, fresh flowers, of course, in the grander rooms, and the deep, even, unfailing warmth, and the soft light, and the quiet. A passenger might close the white door of his stateroom upon the long carpeted corridor, and sit in his own snug room with a book, while the vessel carried him unfelt over the water, and forget entirely that beyond the panelled wall and the closed porthole there lay the cold black water of the Atlantic, a mile deep and stretching away in the night for 1,000 miles on every side. On the evening of her first day out, the vessel crossed the narrow water from England to France and lay to off the port of Cherbourg, on the coast of Normandy, as the light was failing, and this was one of the most beautiful sights of the voyage. She was too large to enter the harbour, and so she waited out in the roadstead, at anchor, ablaze from end to end with electric light, a lit city hanging on the darkening water. And out from the shore to meet her came 2 small tender ships, crammed with passengers and their luggage and the mails, chugging across the twilight sea toward the great glowing wall of her side. Aboard those tenders were some of the most famous people who would sail on her, wealthy Americans for the most part, who had spent the winter travelling in Europe, in Paris and Rome and along the Nile, and were now going home. And as the little tenders drew alongside, and the passengers came aboard and looked up at what they had boarded, even these people, who had seen everything that money could show them, fell silent with wonder. For here came a whole procession of the fashionable world. Here came the Astors, John Jacob Astor and his young wife Madeleine. He, one of the wealthiest men in all America, the head of a family whose name was a byword for riches. She, a girl of 18, newly married, expecting their child, the 2 of them returning from a long tour abroad that had been, in part, a way of letting a certain amount of gossip die down at home. Here came Benjamin Guggenheim, of the great mining and smelting family, another of the fabulously rich, travelling in high style with his valet and his chauffeur, and a lady who was not his wife. Here came Margaret Brown, of Denver in Colorado, a warm, loud, generous, irrepressible woman who had been born poor and had married a man who then struck it rich in the silver mines, and who now spent her fortune on good causes and on seeing the world, and who was worth, in her own bold way, a dozen of the quieter grandees around her. They came up out of the tenders and into the light, and stewards took their names and led them away to their suites, and the vessel gathered them in. When the tenders had done their work and drawn away again toward the twinkling shore, and the last of the passengers and the mail were aboard, the anchor came up and the ship turned her head to the sea once more and stood out into the channel in the dark, bound now for one more stop at Queenstown in the south of Ireland, and then for the open ocean and New York. Behind her the lights of France sank slowly into the night. Ahead lay 3,000 miles of dark water, and a week of the finest living that the age could provide. And all through the warm ship, in the staterooms and the suites, the passengers were settling in, unpacking, dressing, ringing for their stewards, exploring, meeting one another, beginning to feel the particular pleasure of a long voyage just begun, the pleasure of having nothing to do for days on end, but be comfortable and be entertained and be carried in perfect ease over the sea. After Cherbourg and the coast of France, the vessel had one more call to make before she faced the open ocean, and it was the loveliest and the last of her partings from the old countries, the little harbour of Queenstown on the southern coast of Ireland. She came to it on the second day, standing in toward the green Irish hills in the morning light, and anchored out in the deep water off the harbour mouth too great to come in. And once more the tenders put out from the shore to meet her, small boats crossing the bright water, bringing the last of her passengers and the last of her mails out to the waiting giant. Most of those who boarded here were of a different sort from the millionaires of Cherbourg. They were the Irish immigrants, for the most part, young men and young women leaving their homeland to seek a new life across the sea in America, as so many of their countrymen had gone before them. They came up out of the tenders with their bundles and their boxes and their bright, hopeful faces, casting a last look back at the green shore they were leaving, and then turning their eyes westward to the future. And they came out too, in little bumboats alongside, the traders of the harbour, come to do a last brisk business with the passengers at the rail, holding up their wares for sale, the fine Irish lace, and the linen and the small souvenirs of the old country, which the passengers bought and bargained for, and hauled up on lines to the decks above, a last bit of colour and commerce before the sea. And then the last of the bumboats sheered off, and the traders pulled away with their takings, and the tenders went chuffing back toward the harbour mouth with the empty mailbags and a few disembarking passengers aboard. On the decks the emigrants crowded to the after rail and would not leave it. And this was the thing that those who saw it remembered, the young men and women of Ireland standing quite silent, looking back at the green hills going away from them, at the little white houses along the water and the spire above the town, knowing that most of them would never in their lives see any of it again. Someone among them began to play a pipe, and the thin tune went out over the water behind the vessel, and one by one the watchers turned from the rail at last, and went below to their berths and their bundles and their new beginning. Aston, the coast of Ireland, thinned to a low green line, and then to a smudge, and then to nothing at all. Europe was finished. Ahead there was only the Atlantic, and the West, and America somewhere beyond the rim of the sea, and the true crossing had begun. Every ship has her master, and the master of this one was a figure worth knowing, for he was, in his way, as celebrated as any millionaire aboard. His name was Edward Smith, and he was the senior captain of the whole line, the Commodore, the most trusted and most beloved of all their commanders, a big, calm, white-bearded man of comfortable middle age with a pair of steady blue eyes and an air of such perfect, unhurried assurance that the mere sight of him on his bridge could set a nervous passenger at ease. He had been at sea for 40 years and more, and had commanded the line's greatest ships, and he was so well liked by the wealthy travellers of the day that many of them would book their crossing only on a ship that he commanded, and followed him from one vessel to the next. They called him, half in jest and half in earnest, the millionaire's captain. To sail under Captain Smith was itself a kind of luxury, a guarantee that all was as it should be, that a safe and steady and gentlemanly hand was upon the helm. He was by all accounts the very picture of what a ship's captain ought to be. He wore his uniform beautifully. He had a warm, courteous, dignified manner, neither stiff nor familiar. He could talk easily with the Duchess at his table, and just as easily with the humblest of his crew. In the evenings he would often dine in the first-class saloon, at the captain's table, or as the guest of one of the leading families aboard, and to be asked to sit with him was a mark of high favour, a thing the ladies angled for, and the gentlemen valued. He would tell his stories of the sea in his quiet, modest way, and laugh at the jokes, and preside over the table with an old sailor's easy grace, and then, when the evening was done, excuse himself courteously and go back up to his bridge, to the dark and the cold and the responsibility, and see that his ship was well. For this voyage was, it was widely believed, to be his last. He was of an age to retire, and the crossing on the newest and grandest ship of the line was to be the crown and the close of his long career, a final triumphant passage before he laid down his command and went home to his wife and his daughter and his garden for good. It gave a particular sweetness to his presence aboard, this sense of a great career coming to its fitting end, of the finest captain finishing on the finest ship. He moved about her with a quiet pride, greeting the passengers he knew, of whom there were many from a lifetime of crossings, and the passengers, seeing him, felt themselves in the safest of hands. There he is now, if you look up, a solid figure on the high bridge in the last of the light, his beard white against the darkening sky, looking out over the bows of his ship toward the open sea, entirely content, a man at the very summit of his profession, taking his splendid new command out upon the ocean. There was another man aboard who loved the liner in a different way, and more deeply than anyone, and that was the man who had made her. His name was Thomas Andrews, and he was the ship's builder, or rather her designer, the head of the drawing office of the great yard in Belfast that had brought her into being, and the nephew of the man who owned it. She was, in a very real sense, his creation. He had laboured over her plans for years, had watched her grow on the slipway from a keel to a mountain of steel, had thought about her, it was said, almost without ceasing. And now he was crossing on her maiden voyage, as he always did with the ships he built, to see how she behaved at sea, to note everything that might be bettered, and to take a quiet, proprietary, fatherly pleasure in the thing he had made. You would see him everywhere about the vessel, for he was never still. A tall, strong, handsome Irishman in his late 30s, in a plain suit rather than the finery of the passengers, he went through her from end to end, up and down, into places the passengers never saw and back again, notebook always in his hand. He noticed everything, that a particular door swung the wrong way, that a certain corner wanted more light, that the coat hooks in the staterooms had been fixed with too many screws, that this pantry might be arranged more handily, or that reading lamp shifted a little. Nothing was too small for his attention, for he cared about the ship the way a great craftsman cares about his work, down to the last detail, and he wanted her to be perfect. The stewards and the engineers and the crew all knew him and liked him, for he was a modest and a kindly man, easy with everyone, as ready to talk with a stoker as with a millionaire, and he understood the vessel, every rivet and plate and pipe of her, as no one else alive did or ever would. There was something moving in it, this quiet man walking his great creation on her first voyage, so proud of her and so watchful over her, seeing her at last doing the thing he had built her to do, carrying her thousands over the water in comfort and safety and splendour. He had put the best of himself into her. He knew her strengths, and he knew, as a maker always does, her every small imperfection, the little things that no one else would ever notice, and he moved among the happy, careless, wealthy passengers, who saw only the beauty and the luxury, and guessed nothing of the years of thought and labour beneath it, with the private satisfaction of the man who had conceived the whole marvel and seen it made real. Of all the people aboard, in all the grand rooms, none looked upon the ship with quite the eyes of Thomas Andrews, for to the others she was a wonder to be enjoyed, but to him she was a thing he had loved into being, and was watching, now, take her first long walk upon the sea. Now let us leave the particular people for a while and see how the days themselves went by on board her, for the rhythm of a crossing had a character of its own, and was a large part of the pleasure of it. Out here upon the open ocean, with land 1,000 miles behind and 1,000 miles ahead, there was, blessedly, nothing whatever that anyone was obliged to do. The whole art of the voyage was ease, and the days shaped themselves around the small, comfortable ceremonies of eating and resting and taking the air, with long, soft hours of nothing in between. A passenger might rise late and take a leisurely breakfast, and then drift up to the open deck to see what kind of day the sea had brought. The pleasure of the daylight hours was the promenade. All along the upper decks ran broad covered walks, sheltered from the wind by glass screens, where the passengers strolled up and down in the sea air, greeting their acquaintances, taking their exercise, watching the grey-green water slide endlessly past far below. When they tired of walking there were the deck chairs, row upon row of them, wooden chairs with long footrests, each one hired for the voyage and marked with its occupant's name, and here a passenger might settle for hours, wrapped snugly in a thick rug against the chill, with a book or a cup of hot bouillon brought round by a deck steward in the middle of the morning, and simply lie and watch the sea and the sky and doze in the salt air. There was a particular deep contentment in it, in lying warm and idle on the deck of a liner, rocked very gently, with the cold, clean wind on your face and nothing at all to think about, and nowhere at all to be, while the ship bore you steadily on toward the far side of the world. Below decks, for those who wanted them, there were amusements of every kind. There were card games in the smoking room and the lounge, and long conversations over coffee, and the writing of letters that would be posted from New York. There were books to be borrowed from the ship's library, and quiet corners to read them in. Some passengers played at the shuffleboard or the deck games, some simply walked and talked, some, in the modern way, exercised in the gymnasium, or swam, or took the baths, of which more shortly. And always threading through the day, there was the gentle business of meeting and being met, of striking up acquaintance with the interesting people all around, for an enormous liner drew together, for a week, a company of the wealthy and the notable from 2 continents, thrown into easy proximity, and half the sport of the voyage was in the company. The hours passed slowly and sweetly, the sea slid by, the vessel throbbed on, and toward the middle of the afternoon, as the light began to soften, thoughts would turn pleasantly toward the event of the day, which was dinner, and toward the long luxurious business of getting ready for it. Among the newest wonders of the ship, and the ones that most amused and delighted her passengers, were the rooms given over to that very modern enthusiasm, physical exercise. High up on the boat deck, close by the head of the grand staircase, with tall windows looking out over the sea, there was a gymnasium, bright and clean and fitted out with the most up-to-date apparatus that the age could devise, and it was one of the marvels of the vessel. Here a passenger might work off the effects of the enormous meals in the most entertaining ways imaginable, under the cheerful direction of the gymnasium instructor, a brisk and friendly man in white flannels who was always on hand to show a nervous beginner how the machines were worked. What machines they were! There were mechanical horses, on which a lady or gentleman might sit and be jogged up and down as though riding to hounds, without ever leaving the room. There was a mechanical camel, which bucked and swayed in imitation of the real beast and set everyone laughing. There were rowing machines on which a man might pull away, as if in a racing boat, and there were stationary bicycles, fixed to the floor, with a pair of large clock faces on the wall before them, one red and one blue, whose needles raced each other round as the 2 riders pedalled, so that a gentleman might have a bicycle race with his friend and never move an inch across the floor. It was all quite new, and quite absurd, and thoroughly enjoyable, and the passengers came to try it as much for the fun and the novelty as for the good of their health, and stood about watching one another ride the electric camel with great hilarity. There was something wonderfully of its moment in it, this gleaming room of clever machines rocking and whirring away in the middle of the ocean, full of well-fed, wealthy people playing at exercise for their amusement. It spoke of the whole spirit of the ship, and of the age that had built her, the delight in machinery, the confidence in progress, the sense that human ingenuity had conquered every difficulty and turned even the crossing of a wild ocean into an occasion for comfort and diversion and fun. A gentleman might rise in the morning, ride the mechanical horse for half an hour with the sea sparkling through the windows, take a turn on the rowing machine, and then go down to a breakfast of many courses, well satisfied that he had earned it. And a lady might sit upon the camel and be jolted about and laugh until she was breathless, and think it the most modern and delightful notion anywhere. It was play, really, more than exercise, the happy play of people who had everything, aboard a ship that had thought of everything in the last sunny, confident days before the world changed. Ditto down in the liner, well below the waterline, there were pleasures of a more languorous kind, and the first of these was a thing almost unheard of at sea, a swimming bath. Deep in her lower decks, the ship carried an enormous tank of water, one of the first heated swimming pools ever to go to sea, filled with warmed seawater, tiled and clean and softly lit, where a passenger might swim and float and paddle in perfect warmth, while the cold grey Atlantic thundered past unseen on the far side of the steel a few feet away. To swim in warm water in the middle of the ocean, safe and snug and comfortable, with a mile of cold black sea beneath the floor, was one of those small impossibilities that the vessel made real, and the bathers loved it. But grander even than the swimming bath, and stranger, were the Turkish baths, and these were among the most extraordinary rooms in the entire ship, for the decorators had given them over entirely to an oriental fantasy, a dream of the East set deep in the belly of a British liner. You came down into a cooling room done in the richest style of old Araby, the walls faced in gleaming blue and green tiles, the ceiling crossed with gilded beams, bronze lamps of intricate Eastern work hanging down and casting a warm patterned light, and low couches spread with cushions where a bather might lie and cool and rest. Even the portholes were disguised, hidden behind carved wooden screens in the Cairo manner, so that the light coming through them fell in delicate patterns, and you forgot entirely that you were at sea, and might have been in some cool tiled chamber of a palace in Damascus or Constantinople. From this enchanted room you passed into the hot rooms, growing hotter as you went, where the steam rose and the heat soaked into your bones, and there were shampooing rooms and douches, and the newfangled electric baths besides. And afterward you came back to the cool tiled chamber, and lay upon the couches under the bronze lamps, wrapped in warm towels, utterly at peace. It is worth pausing on the strangeness and the splendour of it, that far down in the hull of a ship, below the surface of the sea, in the very last place you would look for such a thing, there should be this jewelled oriental dream, this warm scented tiled chamber of the East, where the richest people anywhere lay drowsing under the lamps while the ship bore them through the northern night. It was luxury piled upon luxury, comfort heaped upon comfort, until it all passed beyond mere richness into a kind of wonder, a sense that here every dream of ease and beauty had been made solid and set afloat. The passengers who came up from the baths, warm and languid and soothed, drifting back through the panelled corridors toward their staterooms in the late afternoon, moved in a haze of well-being that few of them had ever known ashore, and would remember, all their lives, as something close to enchantment. For those with more vigorous tastes there was a squash court, a proper rackets court built right into the vessel, down among the lower decks, with a professional player kept aboard to give the passengers a game or a lesson. And there was a peculiar pleasure in playing so brisk and earthbound a game as squash, while crossing the deep ocean, the ball banging off the walls, the players sweating and calling the score, and all the while the vessel carrying the little bright-lit court steadily on through the dark water. A gentleman might book the court and the professional for half an hour, and play as hard a game as he would in his club at home, and then go up and bathe and dress for dinner with a fine appetite. It was one more of the ship's quiet astonishments that she should carry such a quart at all. Elsewhere about her decks were all the small conveniences of a town gathered up and set afloat, so that a passenger need want for nothing during the crossing. There was a barber's shop, its windows and shelves bright with the little souvenirs that travellers love, postcards and pennants and small trinkets bearing the flag of the line, ribbons and toys and pipes and tobacco, so that a man might get a shave and a haircut and buy a keepsake to carry home. There was the inquiry office near the foot of the grand staircase, where a clerk in the line's uniform would answer any question under the sun, tell you the run the liner had made that day, sell you a ticket for the swimming bath or the squash court or the Turkish baths, and generally set you right about anything that puzzled you. There was the purser's office, where the wise passenger lodged the great jewels and the rolls of banknotes in the strong safe, drawing them out again only when they were wanted for the evening. And through all these little offices and shops there moved quietly and endlessly the whole vast staff of the ship, the small city of people, whose single purpose was the comfort of the few hundred passengers in the grand rooms above. There were the stewards and the stewardesses who kept the staterooms and answered the bells, the deck stewards who arranged the chairs and brought the rugs and the hot bouillon, the waiters and the wine stewards and the cooks, the barbers and the lift boys and the bath attendants, the clerks and the pursers, a whole population of the willing and the deft and the perfectly trained, moving through the vessel on their silent errands, so that everything the passenger might want appeared before him as if by magic, and everything he had done with vanished away, and all the labour that made the machine of comfort run so smoothly went on almost entirely unseen. It is time now that we followed the passengers into the greatest ceremony of their day, for the afternoon is fading, and it is nearly time to dress for dinner. Dinner, aboard such a ship, was not merely a meal. It was the event of the day, the occasion for which everything else was a kind of preparation, and the dressing for it was a ceremony in itself, unhurried and elaborate and full of pleasure. As the afternoon light failed, and the sea went grey and then dark beyond the portholes, the passengers withdrew to their staterooms and gave themselves over, for an hour or more, to the delightful business of making themselves magnificent. The bells rang up and down the corridors, summoning the stewards and the stewardesses. Baths were drawn, hot and deep and scented, and the heavy trunks stood open, spilling out silk and satin and fine black cloth. For the very rich did not dress themselves, of course. They had brought their own people to do it for them, the ladies' maids and the gentlemen's valets who travelled with them everywhere, and who now went quietly about their work in the glowing rooms. Maid would dress her mistress's hair and lace her and lift the gown over her head and settle it, and bring out the jewel case and fasten the diamonds at her throat and the rings upon her fingers, until the woman who had lain that afternoon in a deck chair in a plain rug rose up, transformed, shining, armoured in silk and stones, a great lady ready to be seen. And in the next room a valet would lay out his master's evening clothes, the stiff white shirt and the white tie and the black tailcoat, and help him into them, and brush him down and hand him his watch and his cigarette case, until the gentleman too was perfect, groomed and gleaming and ready to descend. These servants had their own quiet world aboard, their own dining saloon set apart where they took their meals, neither passengers nor quite crew, a whole hidden population of the deft and the discreet, without whom the splendour above could not have been sustained for a single evening. And then, dressed and jewelled and perfumed, the passengers came out of their staterooms into the corridors, and the whole character of the ship changed. Where all afternoon there had been tweed and rugs and comfortable idleness, now there was glitter and formality and the rustle of silk, the men in their stark black and white, the women in every colour, in gowns from the great houses of Paris and London, hung with the pearls and the diamonds and the emeralds that were the visible sign of their fortunes, a slow gathering procession of the beautiful and the wealthy, moving through the warm gold light toward the head of the grand staircase, and the reception room, and the dining saloon below. The scent of the flowers mingled now with 100 perfumes. A low murmur of talk and laughter rose along the passages, and everywhere there was that particular heightened air, that pleasant tension of expectancy that comes before a grand and formal and delicious occasion, when everyone is at their finest and the evening is all still to come. Now, through the murmur and the movement, there came a sound, clear and bright and thrilling, that ran through the vessel and set every heart a little quicker, the sound of a bugle. For it was the custom aboard the big liners that a bugler should sound the call to dinner, walking the decks and blowing a lively old tune upon his instrument, a tune that told the passengers, in the merriest way, that the hour had come and the tables were laid. The clear notes rang down the corridors and up the stairwells, and at the sound of them the last stragglers hurried to finish dressing, and the corridors filled, and the whole company began to move, as one toward the light and the music below. They gathered first in the reception room, a large and gracious apartment near the dining saloon, panelled in white and hung with fine tapestry, spread with a deep soft carpet, and set about with comfortable chairs and settees where the passengers might meet and mingle before they went in to dine. And here, waiting for them, was the music, for the ship bore her own orchestra, a small band of skilled musicians who played through the evening, and as the passengers gathered in the reception room, the strings struck up, light and lovely, the popular airs and waltzes of the day, filling the room with melody beneath the hum of talk. Stewards moved among the crowd with trays, and there was a glass of something to be had before dinner, and the wealthy and the fashionable stood about in little knots, greeting one another, admiring the gowns, exchanging the small news of the liner, the run she had made, the fineness of the weather, the wonders they had discovered that day, and the diamonds flashed under the electric light, and the music played, and the flowers scented the air, and it was as brilliant a scene as any drawing-room in London or New York could have shown. It was here, before dinner, that the society of the ship displayed itself in full, and half the pleasure of the evening was in the watching. There went the financiers and their wives, there the titled English travelling home or abroad, there the famous beauty, and the noted author, and the man whose name was in all the newspapers. There, holding court, warm and loud and merry, was Margaret Brown of Denver, who had risen from nothing, and who cared nothing for the stiff proprieties, and who could talk to anyone about anything. And there, quieter, moving among their friends, were the couples who had been married so long that they seemed one person, and the young ones lately wed, and the solitary travellers glad of the company. Captain Smith himself might be there, splendid in his mess dress, the guest of honour at some great family's table, his white beard and his easy dignity the very centre of the room, and over it all the music played, and the light glowed, and the vessel bore them gently on, until at length the doors to the dining saloon were opened, and the head waiter bowed, and the whole shining company went in to dine. The first-class dining saloon of the Titanic was the largest room ever to go to sea, a mighty and beautiful hall that ran the full width of the ship and stretched away, table beyond table, farther than you would have thought a room afloat could reach. It was done in a graceful old English style, panelled and painted a soft warm white, with a moulded ceiling and tall windows of leaded glass that hid the dark portholes and made you feel you dined in the hall of a country house on land rather than on a ship at sea. Hundreds could sit down in it at once, at tables large and small, spread with snowy linen and gleaming with the silver and the crystal and the china of the line, each set with its little shaded lamp and its posy of fresh flowers. And when the room was full and lit and every table taken, the whole space glittered and murmured like a field of light. Here the company took their places, the parties gathering at their tables, the solitary travellers shown to their seats, and the long, delicious business of dinner began. And what a dinner it was! Course followed course, on and on, a procession of 10 courses and more, that seems to our plainer age scarcely believable. Raw oysters to begin, and then soups, a clear consommé or a thick cream, and then a fish, poached salmon in a rich sauce, and then the entrees, tender cuts of beef and lamb, and a course of roasted fowl, and a sorbet chilled with punch to clear the palate halfway through, and roast duckling or squab, the little tender pigeon, with vegetables and salads and the rich pale pate that the wealthy loved, and then the sweets, the puddings and the jellies and the peaches steeped in liqueur, the eclairs and the ices, and then the fruit and the cheeses and the coffee, and the little chocolates with the coffee, until the diner could not have swallowed another morsel if his life had hung upon it. With each course its own wine, poured by the wine steward from the great cellars of the vessel, the pale hocks and the golden sauternes, and the deep clarets and the champagne standing in its bucket of ice. It was gluttony, no doubt, on a heroic scale, but it was gluttony raised into an art, served with a grace and a ceremony that made it a kind of theatre. The waiters moved among the tables in silent, perfect order, whisking away one course and setting down the next, filling the glasses, anticipating every want. The orchestra played on softly beyond the doors. The talk and the laughter rose and mingled with the music and the clink of silver on china, and the wealthy and the beautiful sat at their flowered tables in the bright warm hall, and ate and drank and talked the evening away, while beyond the leaded windows, unseen and unthought of, the cold Atlantic slid endlessly past in the dark. There were the financiers and the heiresses, the young couples laughing over the wine and the old ones content in their long companionship, and over all of them the light poured down, and the flowers breathed out their scent, and the finest dinner afloat went on and on in the largest and most beautiful dining room that had ever crossed the sea. There was, for those who wished it, an alternative to the vast dining saloon, and it was in its way even grander, or at least more exclusive, more fashionable, more the very last word in modern luxury. This was the à la carte restaurant, a separate and independent restaurant set high in the ship, which the passengers, with the fond half-mockery of people who knew the finest things, had nicknamed the Ritz, after the famous hotel. It was not run by the shipping line at all, but by a celebrated restaurateur who had brought aboard his own staff, his own French and Italian waiters, and his own great chef, and who ran it as his own establishment, so that dining there was like dining at the very best restaurant in London or Paris, save that it happened to be crossing the Atlantic. The room itself was exquisite, small and intimate after the vastness of the saloon, panelled in fine French walnut, carved and gilded in the delicate manner of the court of old France, hung with silk, lit softly by crystal lamps upon the little tables. Here there was no fixed hour, and no single sitting. A passenger might dine when he pleased, at whatever hour suited him, choosing freely from a long menu of the finest French cooking, at a price additional to his passage, which was precisely the point, for it made the Ritz the resort of the very grandest and most particular of the passengers, those who wished to dine apart from the general company, in their own chosen circle, in the height of style. To take a table there was to declare oneself among the elect of the elect. And it was here, one evening of the voyage, that a scene was played out that gathered up much of the glamour of the liner into a single room. For one of the great Philadelphia families aboard, immensely rich, gave a private dinner party in the Ritz, and their guest of honour was Captain Smith himself. Picture it, the little panelled room aglow with soft light, the table laid with the finest of everything, the flowers, the crystal, the gold, the host and hostess and their chosen guests, the cream of the American aristocracy of wealth, the men in their tails and the women blazing with jewels, and at the head of the table the white-bearded captain, the commodore of the line, honoured and at his ease, telling his stories of the sea, while the good wine went round and the French waiters glided silently to and fro. Outside, the night and the cold and the black sea. Inside, warmth and light and laughter. and the very best that the age could offer, gathered in one small gilded room far out upon the ocean. It was the ship at her most brilliant, the age at its most golden, a perfect small jewel of an evening, and those who were there never forgot it. Adjoining the Ritz, and sharing its kitchen and its air of fashionable ease, was a room that was quite new to the ships of that day, a charming novelty that everyone wanted to try, the Café Parisien. It had been made to look, as nearly as could be managed at sea, like a pavement café on a Paris boulevard, all light and greenery and open air, though of course it was safely enclosed against the Atlantic wind. The walls were set with white lattice work, trellises of the kind you would find in a garden, and up them climbed live ivy and other creeping plants, real and green and growing, so that you sat as if in a leafy arbour. The furniture was light wicker, little tables and comfortable chairs, and tall windows looked out over the sea. It was fresh and pretty and informal, far removed from the heavy grandeur of the saloon, and it quickly became the favourite haunt of the younger and livelier passengers. Here after dinner, or indeed at any hour, the young set gathered, the newly married couples on their wedding journeys, the bright young men and the pretty girls, the ones who found the dining saloon a little stiff and the smoking room too heavy with cigars, came here to sit among the ivy in the wicker chairs and drink their coffee, and perhaps a small glass of something sweet and French, and talk and laugh and watch the dark sea go by beyond the windows. There was a lightness to it, a gaiety, the particular happy ease of young people with money and leisure and the whole bright future before them, thrown together on an adventure and delighting in one another's company. The talk ran on, and the laughter rose, and the ivy trembled faintly with the motion of the vessel, and the lights of the café glowed out over the black water, a little warm green bower of youth and pleasure set down in the middle of the enormous dark ocean. It was, the passengers said, the most delightful spot on the entire ship, and it taught something of the spirit of the age as much as any grand saloon, this reaching after lightness, after informality, after the fresh and the new and the charming, after a Paris café carried out to sea, to sit there in the evening, warm and easy among the greenery, with good coffee and good company, and the sound of low laughter all around, and the engines throbbing faintly far below, and the endless dark water sliding past the windows toward a new continent, was to taste a kind of happiness that seemed in that moment as though it might go on forever, a happiness made of youth and safety and comfort and the sweetness of the voyage, and the young people who tasted it there, among the ivy and the lamplight, in the little Parisian café afloat, would carry the memory of those evenings bright and unshadowed, for the rest of their days. When the ladies rose from the dinner table and withdrew, as the custom of that age still required, the gentlemen were left to their own devices, and many of them made their way, cigar in hand, to the room that was by long tradition entirely their own, the first-class smoking room. It lay high in the ship, toward the stern, and it was the most masculine and clubbable of all her apartments, got up to look precisely like the smoking room of a fine gentleman's club in London, so that a man might sink into it and forget he was at sea at all. The walls were panelled in dark, rich mahogany, carved and inlaid with delicate patterns of mother-of-pearl that gleamed softly in the lamplight. The chairs were deep and covered in leather. There was a real coal fire, or the near likeness of one, and above the mantel hung a large and handsome painting of a ship coming into harbour. It was a warm, dim, comfortable, smoky place, heavy with the scent of good cigars and old leather and spirits, and no woman ever set foot in it. Here the men of the vessel gathered in the evenings, and here, more than anywhere else, the real business and the real talk of that wealthy world went on. They sat about the little tables with their brandy and their whisky and their cigars, and they talked, as such men talked, of money and markets and politics and railways and the state of the world, of the ship herself, her sighs and her speed and her wonders of the deals done and the fortunes made. Some of the greatest men in America were there of an evening, the financiers and the industrialists and the heirs to colossal fortunes, the men whose decisions moved markets and built cities, sitting at their ease in the leather chairs, wreathed in cigar smoke, masters of the golden age they lived in. There were card games, of course, for high-stakes bridge and poker played long into the night, and among the players, it must be said, there moved sometimes the professional gambler, the smooth and plausible card sharp, who worked the ocean liners as his hunting ground, fleecing the unwary rich of a night's fortune, for where money gathered, so did those who lived by relieving other men of it. There was a particular character to those evenings in the smoking room, a settled masculine ease, the sense of powerful and confident men entirely at home afloat and in their own success. The fire glowed, the smoke rose blue in the lamplight, the cards were dealt, the talk ran on low and steady, and the vessel carried them all on through the night, her lights blazing out across the water, her engines throbbing far below. Man might sit there past midnight, when the room had thinned and the fire burned low, with a last cigar and a last glass, in the deep leather chair, warm and drowsy and content, master of all he surveyed, and think, if he thought of anything beyond the cards and the talk, only that the world was very good and very safe, and arranged, on the whole, entirely to his satisfaction, and that this beautiful ship was the very proof and crown of it. Grandest of all the public rooms where the passengers gathered after dinner was the lounge, and it was perhaps the most beautiful apartment in the liner, save only the grand staircase itself. It had been fashioned after the manner of the vast palace of Versailles, in the rich and graceful style of the France of the old kings, panelled and carved and gilded, with tall windows and a great carved fireplace and a moulded ceiling, furnished with elegant settees and armchairs and little tables, and warmed by a fire, and softened everywhere with flowers and with palms in tubs, so that it had something of the air of a conservatory and something of the air of a royal drawing-room. Here, unlike the smoking room, both sexes gathered, and here the social life of the ship found its centre in the hours after dinner. It was a room made for ease and for company. Parties settled into the deep chairs to talk over their coffee and their liqueurs. The card tables filled, for bridge and whist were the passion of the age, and many a rubber was played out there of an evening. Some passengers read, or wrote, or simply sat and watched the brilliant company, and often in a corner of the room the vessel's musicians played, the sweet strains of the strings drifting over the talk, the waltzes and the light airs and the popular melodies of the day, so that the whole room was bathed in music as in a soft light. The ladies, jewelled and gowned, moved and mingled. The gentlemen come up at last from the smoking room rejoined them. Friendships ripened and romances stirred, and the wealthy and the celebrated of two continents passed the evening together in the gilded warmth, as though in the grandest salon of the grandest house anywhere, which for that week, in a sense, it was. To stand in the doorway of the lounge late in the evening and look in was to see the age itself at its most golden and most self-assured. The soft light of the lamps fell on the gleaming panelling and the flowers and the jewels. The music played, the talk and the low laughter rose and fell. The beautiful people sat about in their beautiful clothes in the beautiful room, entirely at their ease, entirely happy, entirely certain that all was good, and that it would go on being good forever. There was in it a kind of perfection, a completeness, a sense of having reached the very summit of what human comfort and human elegance could achieve. Outside, beyond the tall windows, lay the cold and the dark and the endless sea, but here within was warmth and light and music and flowers and every good thing, and it seemed, on such an evening, that it must always be so, and that nothing on earth could ever be otherwise. For those who wanted quiet, and there were always some, there was a gentler room still, set a little apart from the music and the card play and the bustle of the lounge, the reading and writing room. This was a lighter, calmer, more delicate apartment, panelled and painted in soft white, with tall, bright windows and comfortable chairs, and it was thought of, in the manner of the day, as belonging especially to the ladies, a retreat from the masculine fugue of the smoking room and the crowded gaiety of the lounge. Here a passenger might come to be still, to read a book borrowed from the ship's library, to write letters home, or simply to sit in a quiet corner with her own thoughts, while the vessel carried her on. It was a peaceful place. The light was soft, the chairs were deep, and there was about it the particular hush of a room where people are reading and writing, broken only by the turning of a page or the scratch of a pen or the low murmur of two friends talking quietly in a corner. Ladies sat at the writing tables composing their letters, the long descriptive letters that travellers wrote in those days, full of the wonders of the ship, the size of her, the splendour of the dining saloon, the marvel of the swimming bath, the famous people they had glimpsed at dinner, all to be posted the moment the liner reached New York and carried back over the sea to families at home. Others sat reading, in the deep chairs by the windows, a novel perhaps borrowed from the well-stocked library, lost for an hour in another world, while their own world of luxury throbbed gently on around them. There was a sweetness in that quiet room that the grander apartments could not give, a sense of peace and privacy and repose. To sit there in the late evening, when the light was low and the room half empty, with a book in your lap that you were not quite reading, and feel the faint, steady tremor of the ship beneath you, and hear, very far off, the muffled sound of the music from the lounge, and know that beyond the calm, bright windows the whole dark ocean stretched away on every side while you sat safe and warm and still within, was to feel a contentment deep and quiet and complete. Here, more than in the blaze of the dining saloon or the brilliance of the lounge, a passenger might feel the true, still inward luxury of the voyage, the luxury of perfect safety and perfect ease, of having nothing anywhere to trouble you, of being carried warm and cared for across the wide sea toward home. Oh, let us look a little closer now at some of the remarkable people who were crossing on her, for the vessel carried, that spring, a company such as few ships have ever held. The richest of them all, and the most famous, was the man I promised you at the very beginning of the evening, John Jacob Astor. His was one of the great names of America, a name that meant money on a scale hard to imagine, for his family had grown fabulously wealthy over generations, above all in the land and buildings of New York, until they owned vast tracts of the greatest city in America, and drew from it a river of rent. He himself had built some of the most famous hotels in New York, palaces of marble and gold that set the standard of luxury for the age. He was a colonel and an inventor of sorts who took out patents on his contrivances, and he had even written a novel, a tale of the future and of travel to other worlds. He was, in short, a man who had everything that wealth could give, and the assurance that goes with it. He was tall and quiet and rather reserved, not a loud or showy man despite his riches, moving through the ship with the calm of one who had never in his life wanted for anything, or doubted his own place in the world. He was travelling with his young wife, and the two of them kept somewhat to themselves, dining quietly, walking the deck together, for their marriage had been much talked about at home, and they were glad, perhaps, of the peace of the sea and the distance from the gossip of New York. And they were going home in the end, for a particular and tender reason, a private happiness that lay ahead of them over the water, and that gave to their quiet a kind of gentle expectancy. To see him come down the grand staircase of an evening, tall and grave and beautifully dressed, the richest man in America descending to dinner beneath the glowing dome, was to see the very embodiment of the golden age, of what its wealth could make of a man, and the other passengers watched him pass with the particular interest that people always take in the very rich and the very famous, whose lives seem from the outside to be gilded all over. And yet, for all his millions, he was but one of a whole company of the enormously wealthy aboard, for the vessel had drawn them from all across 2 continents. There were mining magnates and steel men, railway kings and bankers and heirs to old fortunes, men whose names were household words in the cities, and whose wealth added all together would have ransomed a kingdom. It was said only half in jest that there was more money gathered aboard that one ship than had ever crossed the ocean together before. They came with their wives and their daughters and their servants and their mountains of luggage, and they filled the best suites and the finest cabins, and they dined at the captain's table and gambled in the smoking room and paraded their diamonds in the lounge, and the ship, the newest and grandest and most expensive anywhere, was the perfect setting for them, a jewel box worthy of the jewels it carried. Never, perhaps, had so much wealth and so much fame been gathered into so small and so splendid a space. Very different from the quiet grandees, and a good deal more fun, was a woman I have already named to you, Margaret Brown, of Denver in the state of Colorado, whom the world would later come to know by another name, but who was, at Spring, simply a large, warm, loud, generous, unstoppable force of nature, enjoying herself hugely. Her story was the great American story of the age. She had been born poor, the daughter of Irish immigrants, in a little river town, and had gone out west as a young woman to the rough mining country, and there had married a miner, a big, kindly man as poor as herself. And then, by one of those strokes of fortune that the age loved to tell of, her husband had found the great seam, had struck it enormously rich in the silver and the gold of the mountains, and the penniless pair had woken one morning to find themselves millionaires. Now, what a person does with such a sudden fortune tells you everything about them, and what Margaret Brown did was to set about improving herself and the world with tremendous energy and not the slightest self-doubt. She learned languages, she travelled everywhere, she read and studied and threw herself into good causes, into the rights of working people and of women and of children, into the care of the poor she had so lately been one of. She was clever and brave and kind, and completely without fear or false modesty, and she said exactly what she thought to anyone at all, duchess or docker, which the stiffer sort of old money society found rather alarming and never quite knew what to make of. The grand ladies of New York and Newport had never entirely opened their doors to her for all her wealth, because she was too loud and too new and too herself, but she cared not a straw for their disapproval, and went cheerfully on her way, and was in truth worth a whole drawing-room of them. Aboard the liner she was in her element, for she loved company and adventure and grand new things, and here was the grandest new marvel afloat, full of interesting people. You would find her in the thick of the liveliest gatherings, talking and laughing, full of stories of her travels, warm and unpretentious and hugely alive, making friends with everyone regardless of rank, as ready to talk with a steward as with a countess. There was something wonderfully free and open and generous about her, a bigness of spirit to match the bigness of the country she came from, and the other passengers, even the ones who thought her a little too much, could not help but warm to her. She was America in a single person, self-made and unabashed and kind, and she went through the gilded ship like a fresh wind through a hothouse, and everyone was the better for her passing. There was aboard a couple who moved more quietly than the millionaires, an old husband and wife who were seldom apart, and their story was, of all the stories on the ship, perhaps the most tender. They were Isidor and Ida Strauss, and Isidor Strauss was the owner, with his brother, of the greatest department store in New York, an immense emporium whose name was known to every American, a business he had built up over a lifetime of labor. He had come to America as a boy, the son of a family of Bavarian immigrants with nothing at all, and had risen by his own effort through hard years of striving from poverty to wealth and to public honor. He had even served his country for a time in the Congress, a lawmaker of the nation, a man respected and beloved far beyond his own trade. But the thing that everyone remembered about the Strausses was not his store, nor his fortune, nor his public career. It was the two of them together, and the plain and simple love between them. They had been married for more than 40 years, and in all that time they had scarcely been apart. And when business or duty did part them, even for a day or two, they wrote to each other every single day, letters full of the plain, deep affection of two people who, after a lifetime together, still could not quite bear to be separated. Aboard the vessel you would see them always side by side, the old gentleman with his white beard and his gentle courtly manner, and his wife upon his arm, walking the deck together in the sea air, sitting together at dinner, taking their ease together in the lounge. Two people so long and so happily joined that they seemed, as the other passengers said, to be almost one soul in two bodies. There was something in the sight of them, in their quiet, unshowy devotion, that touched even the gayest and most careless of the young people around them. For in the midst of all that glitter and wealth and youthful high spirits, the Strausses were a reminder of something older and deeper and more precious than any of it, the plain, faithful, enduring love of two ordinary human hearts, grown together over a long lifetime into something that no fortune could buy and no splendor could rival. They had everything the age could give, the store and the money and the honor, but the treasure they truly possessed, and the one they cared for most, was each other. To watch them of an evening, the old couple sitting quietly together amid the brilliant company, content in one another as they had been content for 40 years and more, was to be shown, without a word, what it was that all the striving and the wealth were finally for, and it lent to the great glittering ship, for all her gold and grandeur, a note of a gentler and truer feeling, the note of a long love quietly kept. And there were many more aboard whose names everyone knew, gathered into that one ship as into a single brilliant company. There was one of the most famous journalists in England, a great crusading editor and writer, who had spent his life stirring the conscience of the nation, a bearded, forceful, fascinating man full of strange enthusiasms and deep convictions, travelling to America to speak at a public meeting. Wherever he went aboard, he drew a circle of listeners, for he was a marvellous talker, and the passengers gathered to hear him hold forth on the questions of the day. There was a celebrated dress designer, a woman whose gowns clothed the great ladies and the famous actresses of 2 continents, the very arbiter of fashion of her day, travelling with her husband, a Scottish baronet. The elegant women aboard knew her name as they knew the name of no financier, for she it was who decreed what they should wear. There was a Scottish countess, young and gracious, one of the flowers of the British aristocracy, travelling with her family. There was a popular American author, a writer of clever detective tales much loved by the reading public, crossing with his wife after a happy holiday in Europe, the two of them full of the pleasure of the voyage. There was a distinguished soldier, a military man who served as aide and companion to the President of the United States himself, coming home from a long rest abroad, a courtly, well-liked figure known in the highest circles of Washington. There was a lady who wrote books and knew everyone, clever and charming, and much sought after in the drawing rooms. There was even aboard a young actress of the new moving pictures, one of the first stars of that infant art, pretty and celebrated in her modern way. Financiers, artists, writers, aristocrats, soldiers, beauties, the famous and the fashionable of the age, all thrown together for a week upon the sea. It made for a company such as could hardly have been assembled anywhere else, and it was one of the great pleasures of the crossing, this brilliant society into which a passenger found himself so agreeably dropped. At dinner, in the lounge on the promenade, walking the deck, one moved among the celebrated and the accomplished as easily as among old friends, and struck up acquaintance with people whose names one had read in the newspapers for years. The talk was good, for these were clever and interesting people who had done things and seen things and knew the world. The company was distinguished, and there was over it all the particular glamour that comes when the famous and the fortunate are gathered together in one place, at their ease and at their best. It was, the passengers felt, a kind of floating house party of the fashionable world, the most exclusive and delightful gathering imaginable, carried across the sea in the most beautiful ship ever built, and to be part of it, even for a week, was a thing to remember always. Beneath the splendour and the ease, of course, there was a ship to be run, and running her was the work of a small army of skilled and disciplined men, whom the passengers, in the main, scarcely noticed. So smoothly and so quietly did they do their work. Chief among them, under the captain, were the officers, the men who commanded the ship and stood her watches, and saw her safely over the water. They were a fine body of men, hand-picked from the best of the line service, in their smart dark uniforms, with the gold braid upon the sleeve, and they moved about the vessel, with the calm, brisk, competent air of professional seamen, who knew their business to the last detail. There was the chief officer, and the first, and the second, senior men of long experience, and there were the junior officers beneath them, younger men making their way up in the service, keen and able and proud of their ship. The heart of their world was the bridge, high up at the forward end of the ship, from which she was steered and commanded. It was a place apart from the warmth and the gaiety below, quiet and orderly and serious, where at every hour of the day and night an officer stood his watch, and a seaman held the wheel, and the liner was conned across the trackless water with a care and a precision that never for a moment relaxed. From the bridge the officer on watch could see the whole sweep of the sea ahead, and the long dark length of his ship stretching away behind, and there he stood his 4 hours pacing, watching, giving his quiet orders, while the passengers danced and dined and slept below, and the enormous vessel drove on through the night under his hand. There were lookouts posted too, keen-eyed men set high up in the crow's nest on the foremast, whose whole duty was to watch the sea ahead and report anything they saw, and there was the wheelhouse and the chart room, and all the quiet, disciplined machinery of navigation, the taking of the ship's position by the stars, the working of the courses, the keeping of the log. It was a different life entirely from the one the passengers led, this life of the officers and the crew, a life of duty and watch-keeping and cold night air and constant responsibility, carried on quietly and unremarked a few feet from all the luxury, and yet far removed from it. While the champagne went round in the Ritz and the cards were dealt in the smoking room, the officer of the watch stood on his dark bridge with the wind in his face, and the man at the wheel held her steady on her course. The lookouts strained their eyes into the night ahead, and far below the stokers fed the fires, and by the labour and the vigilance of all these unseen men, the pleasure palace was carried on, bright and snug and safe, across the wide and indifferent ocean. The passengers gave little thought to them, and that was as it should be, for the whole art of the thing was that the labour should be invisible and the ease complete, but the vessel was borne along, night and day, upon the steady watchfulness of men who never rested, and it is right that we should think of them, keeping their watch in the dark, while the bright company slept. Toward the stern, off the smoking room, and the after end of the promenade, there were 2 more delightful rooms that we have not yet seen. The veranda cafes or palm courts, one on either side of the vessel. These were bright, airy places, half conservatory and half tea room, and where the little Parisian cafe was all lattice and lamplight, These looked to the open sea. Their outer walls were mostly window, arched and generous, and beyond them lay the wake, unrolling away astern in a long pale road that a passenger might follow with his eye for miles. Palms stood about in tubs, tall enough to throw shade, and the wicker chairs were drawn up in 2s and 3s facing the water, so that the room had the ease of a hotel terrace on some warm coast rather than a chamber of steel in the North Atlantic. Here passengers took their tea in the afternoon, or their coffee after dinner, and watched the sea go by, and one of the two, connected to the smoking room, was much used by the gentlemen, while the other became, in the way of such matters, the favourite haunt of the youngest travellers of all. For there were children aboard, of course, the children of the wealthy families, and they had their own small share in the wonders of the ship. There were little boys in sailor suits and little girls in white frocks, with their nurses and their nannies in attendance, and they found the vessel the most marvellous playground afloat. They ran, under a watchful eye, along the wide promenade decks. They were taken to see the marvels, the swimming bath and the gymnasium with its rocking mechanical camel that made them shriek with laughter. They played their games in the palm court that had become their own, among the wicker chairs and the potted palms. There were babies too, the very smallest, carried in their nurses' arms or wheeled in their perambulators along the sheltered decks, taking the good sea air. And in the evenings the children were fed and bathed and put to bed in the snug staterooms by their nurses, and tucked up warm while their parents dressed for dinner, and fell asleep to the faint tremor of the engines, rocked by the huge vessel, as by an enormous cradle. There was something especially tender in the thought of the children aboard, in their innocence of everything but the delight of the adventure, to whom the whole magnificent ship was simply a wonderful new place, full of marvels and kind, attentive grown-ups and things to explore. They knew nothing of fortunes or fame or society. They knew only that they were on a beautiful ship, warm and bright and full of wonders, going over the sea to a new place, and that it was all tremendously exciting, and they played and laughed and were petted by everyone, and slept soundly in their warm berths, as happy as children have ever been. The ship gathered them all in, the old couple and the young lovers and the financiers and the little ones in their sailor suits, and brought them together through the northern night, safe and content, every soul aboard wrapped in the same great comfort, from the millionaire in his suite to the baby asleep in the nursery. Not all the passengers aboard walked on 2 legs, for the vessel carried, that spring, a small company of pampered travellers of quite another kind, the dogs of the wealthy. Several of the leading families had brought their pets along with them, as such people often did, unwilling to be parted from a beloved companion even for a week at sea, and so there travelled on the finest ship on earth a little assortment of very fortunate dogs, of the fashionable breeds of the day, whose owners doted on them and would spare them nothing. They were housed in a proper kennel, high up in the ship and cared for by the crew, who fed them and cleaned them, and several times a day brought them out for their exercise, so that the passengers strolling the decks would come upon a member of the crew gravely walking a brace of expensive lapdogs up and down in the sea air. They were much petted and admired, these sea-going dogs, and became in their way small celebrities of the voyage. The children begged to be allowed to pat them. The ladies cooed over them. Their owners paraded them proudly. And there was even, it was said, some cheerful talk among the passengers of getting up an informal dog show before the voyage ended, a little contest of the vessel's dogs, with the pets brought out and walked before admiring judges, purely for the fun of it. Whether it ever came off or no, the mere notion of it tells you something of the light and happy spirit of the crossing, that among all the grave financiers and grand ladies and their weighty affairs, there was room too for so gentle and so foolish and so human a pleasure as a parade of pampered dogs upon the deck of the greatest ship afloat. There was something rather charming in it, this small warm domestic note amid all the grandeur, the beloved pets brought along and fussed over and walked upon the decks, a reminder that the wealthy were, after all, only people, with the same soft affections as anyone, the same fondness for a faithful dog, the same wish to have their loved companions near them. And the dogs, for their part, knew nothing of any of it, of the fame of the ship, or the wealth of their owners, or the wonder of the crossing. They knew only that they were fed, and walked, and petted, and that the people they loved were near, and they slept at night, as soundly and as trustingly as the children, curled warm in their kennel, rocked by the same gentle sea, carried on with all the rest, through the quiet dark toward the morning. Let us go down now for a little while, out of the warmth and the light and the music, down through the decks, past the fine staterooms and below the waterline, into a part of the liner that no passenger ever saw and few ever thought of, and yet without which not one lamp would have burned, nor one engine turned down into the stokeholds where the fires were fed, for all the electric light and the central warmth and the mighty engines that drove the ship, all of it, every scrap, came in the end from one thing, and that was coal, burned in enormous furnaces deep in the belly of the vessel, and the burning of that coal was the work of a small army of men who laboured all the way across the ocean in a heat and a darkness and a din that the passengers above could not have imagined. They were called the firemen, and the trimmers, and among themselves the black gang, for the coal dust blackened them from head to foot until only their eyes showed white. Their world was a series of great hot iron chambers far below, where rank upon rank of furnace doors glowed red, and where the men worked in gangs, watch after watch, shovelling coal into the roaring fires, hour upon hour, stripped to the waist and running with sweat in the terrible heat, while the trimmers wheeled the coal to them in barrows from the great bunkers, in the choking dust and the black night. It was labour of the hardest and most exhausting kind, brutal and hot and unrelenting, carried on in a place like the inside of a furnace itself, deep down where the sea pressed cold against the hull a few feet away, and the din of the machinery was deafening. And it never stopped day or night, all the crossing long, for the fires could never be let die. Watch relieved watch, and the shovels never rested, and the great appetite of the furnaces was fed and fed and fed. Think of it for a moment, that far below the gilded lounge where the band played, below the flowered dining saloon and the warm-scented staterooms, below the swimming bath and the tiled oriental splendour of the Turkish rooms, down in the hot roaring dark at the very bottom of the ship, these men laboured half naked in the heat and the coal dust to make the fires that made the steam that turned the engines and lit the lamps and warmed the rooms and drove the whole floating palace on across the sea. The comfort of the few hundred above rested, quite literally, upon the backs of these hundreds below. The ease and the elegance and the golden light were bought with their sweat and their toil in the dark. They were the hidden heart of the vessel, unseen and unthanked, and the vast vessel moved and shone and lived by the labour of their arms. And it is only right, as we walk the bright decks above, to remember the men in the glowing dark beneath our feet, feeding the fires that carried us all. From the furnaces the heat became steam, and the steam went to the engines, and the engines were themselves among the wonders of the ship, though again a wonder that no passenger was ever shown. Deep in the middle of the vessel stood the engine rooms, and there the immense machines rose up through several decks, engines so vast that a man standing beside them was dwarfed like a child beside a cathedral organ, towering assemblies of gleaming steel, of pistons and rods and cranks as thick as tree trunks, turning and rising and falling in a mighty ceaseless rhythm that shook the very air. Two of these were the enormous reciprocating engines driving the outer propellers, and between them, driven by the steam that had already done its work in the others, was a huge turbine spinning the central screw, a marvel of modern engineering, so that nothing was wasted, and every ounce of the fire's heat was made to serve. To stand in that place, had a passenger been allowed, would have been to stand in the very stronghold of the age's power and confidence. The noise was tremendous, a steady thunder of moving metal. The heat rolled off the machinery in waves. The polished steel flashed as the huge rods rose and fell, and everywhere among the giant engines moved the engineers, calm, competent men in their oil-stained overalls, oil can in hand, watching the dials and tending the machinery, masters of the enormous forces at their command. These were the men who kept the heart of the liner beating, who nursed the engines mile after mile, watch after watch, and who understood the mighty machinery as intimately as the officers above understood the stars. And they too, like the firemen, laboured unseen, in the noise and the heat, so that the passengers might glide on in silence and comfort far above. And here is the strange and beautiful thing, that all this vast and violent power, the roaring furnaces, the thundering engines, the whirling shafts driving the great propellers that churned the sea to foam far astern, all of it was so perfectly contained, so smoothly governed, so utterly mastered, that up above, in the staterooms and the saloons, nothing of it was felt but the faintest tremor, a gentle throb no more, that a passenger soon ceased to notice at all, or came rather to love, as the very pulse and heartbeat of the ship. He lay in his soft bed, or sat over his wine, or drowsed in his deck chair, rocked by that soft, deep rhythm, and thought, if he thought of it at all, only how peaceful it was, and never dreamed of the mighty labour and the harnessed thunder that lay a few decks below him, working without rest to carry him, gently and quietly, and in perfect ease, across the whole width of the ocean. Between the world of the passengers and the world of the furnaces lay yet another hidden kingdom, and this one fed them all, the kitchens, or as the sailors called them, the galleys, for consider what it meant to feed such a ship. There were more than 2,000 souls aboard, passengers and crew of every class, and every one of them had to be fed, 3 times a day and more, all the crossing long, and the first-class passengers in particular expected, and got, meals of a splendour to rival the finest restaurants anywhere, 10 courses and more, prepared to perfection, served hot and fresh at the appointed hour to hundreds of diners at once. To do this required a kitchen on the scale of the vessel herself, and an army of cooks to work it. The great galley lay in the middle of the ship, close by the dining saloons, a vast complex of ranges and ovens and steaming coppers, of larders and pantries and cold rooms, worked by a small multitude of chefs and cooks and bakers and confectioners and scullery hands, ruled over by a head chef of high renown as an admiral rules a fleet. The provisions they had to work with beggar belief, for the vessel had come out of Southampton stored as if for a siege, tens of thousands of pounds of fresh meat and fish and poultry, thousands upon thousands of eggs, tons of potatoes and other vegetables, mountains of flour and sugar, hundreds of gallons of milk, crates of fruit, wheels of cheese, and wine and spirits by the 1,000 bottle, enough to feed a small town for a week, packed into her larders and cold stores. And out of this immense abundance, hour by hour, the cooks conjured the endless procession of dishes that went up to the tables above, the soups and the roasts and the fishes and the French sauces and the puddings and the pastries and the iced confections. It was a labour of extraordinary skill and pace and coordination, carried on in heat and haste and clamour, so that the finished dishes might appear exactly on time and exactly right before the diners in the cool, bright saloons who never gave a thought to how they came there. The waiter set down the perfect plate, the diner ate, and behind that simple moment lay the whole roaring effort of the galley, the chopping and the stirring and the roasting and the plating, the shouted orders and the flashing knives and the sweating cooks, the enormous machine of the kitchen running at full stretch to keep the tables of the rich supplied. It was one more of the hidden labours that upheld the ease above, one more army of unseen men working hard and fast in the heat, so that the passengers might dine, in comfort and in splendour, upon the finest fare that the age could set before them, out in the middle of the empty sea. High up in the ship, in a small cabin near the officers' quarters, there was a room that held one of the true marvels of the new century, a thing so new and so wonderful that it still seemed half like magic, the wireless. For this huge liner could speak, across the empty air, to other ships hundreds of miles away over the horizon, and to stations upon the distant shore, sending her words leaping invisibly through the void with no wire and no cable, faster than any vessel could move, a miracle that would have seemed pure sorcery to the seamen of only a generation before. The apparatus filled the little room, a crowded jumble of instruments and coils and switches, and when it worked, a blue spark would crack and hiss and snap between the terminals, throwing the message out into the night in the strange, stammering code of dots and dashes that was the language of the air. The room was worked by two young men, the wireless operators, keen and clever fellows in their 20s, who sat their long watches at the crackling instrument with the headphones clamped to their ears, listening through the hiss and the crackle for the faint, far voices of other ships, tapping out and taking down the endless stream of messages. And a large part of their traffic on such a voyage was the private messages of the wealthy passengers, for it had become the fashionable thing to send a wireless message from the liner, a marconigram as they called it, to friends and family and business partners ashore. All day the passengers would come up with their messages to be sent, word to a friend in New York that they would arrive on Tuesday, and would he meet the ship? Word to a wife or a mother that all was well and the crossing delightful. A business instruction, a birthday greeting, a note to say the vessel was the most marvellous thing imaginable and the food beyond belief. And the young operators tapped them all out, hour after hour, flinging the little human messages of the passengers out, across the night sea toward the land. There was something wonderful in it, and something that spoke, again, of the whole confident spirit of the age, that even here, alone in the middle of the vast ocean, 1,000 miles from any shore, the passengers were not truly cut off at all, but could reach out across the empty air and touch the distant world, could send a word to a loved one far away, and in a day or two receive one back. The sea, which had always meant separation, silence, the long unbridgeable gap between the traveller and those he left behind, had been conquered even in this. The ship bore her own voice with her, and could call across the darkness to the ends of the earth. To the passengers it was one more marvel among many, one more proof that they lived in a wonderful age that had mastered every element and abolished every distance. And they sent their cheerful messages, and thought no more about it, and went down to dinner, while up in the little room the blue spark cracked and snapped, and the young operators tapped on into the night. Through all the pleasures of the vessel, from the morning to the small hours, there ran one continuous thread of delight, so constant that the passengers came almost to take it for granted, and yet so essential that without it the whole enchantment would have been the poorer, the music. For the ship carried her own musicians, a small band of accomplished players, professional to their fingertips, who played through the day and long into the evening in the public rooms, filling the warm spaces with melody. They were led by a bandmaster of skill and spirit, and they knew, it seemed, every tune on earth, and they moved through the liner as the hours required, playing here in the afternoon and there in the evening, so that wherever the passengers gathered, there too, sooner or later, was the music. Their repertoire was the whole bright popular music of the age, and they played it beautifully. There were the waltzes, slow and sweet and turning, that set the older folk dreaming of the ballrooms of their youth. There were the lively new dance tunes, the ragtime melodies newly come across from America, jaunty and syncopated and irresistibly gay, that the young people loved. There were the airs from the operas and the musical plays, and the sentimental ballads that everyone knew and hummed along to under their breath, and light graceful pieces of the finer sort for the quieter hours. In the reception room before dinner, they played the passengers in. Through the long evening in the lounge, the strings wove their spell over the talk and the card play. The sweet sound of them drifted out along the corridors and up the sweeping staircase, so that a passenger walking to his stateroom late at night might catch, from somewhere behind him, the fading strains of a waltz, and carry the melody with him into his dreams. It is hard to say how much the music gave to the voyage, for it worked upon the passengers below the level of their notice, the way a scent or a warmth works, colouring everything, lifting the spirits, knitting the whole experience together into something finer than the sum of its parts. It made the dining brighter and the evenings more magical. It soothed and it gladdened and it charmed. It was the very voice of the ship's gaiety and grace. To sit in the golden lounge of an evening, warm and well-fed and content, among the flowers and the jewels and the pleasant company, with the sweet strings playing softly in the corner and the vessel gliding on through the night, was to be as near to a kind of perfect earthly happiness as most of those aboard would ever come. And the music was the soul of it, the golden thread that ran through all the splendour and made it sing. Long afterward, those who had sailed on her remembered the music above almost all the rest. Let us go back for a moment from the evening to the gentler hours of the afternoon, for there was one small daily ceremony aboard that deserves its own remembrance, dear above all to the ladies and to the older passengers. That was afternoon tea. As the day wore on toward its close, and the light began to soften over the water, and the long idle hours on deck grew a little chill, there came at 4 o'clock that most civilized and comforting of English institutions, the taking of tea, and the passengers drifted in from the deck chairs and the promenade to one or another of the pleasant public rooms, to the reception room or the palm court among the greenery where the tea was laid. It was a pretty and a soothing hour. The stewards brought the tea in silver pots, and there were delicate cups of thin china, and milk and lemon and sugar, and there were the good things to eat that go with tea, thin bread and butter cut fine, and little sandwiches, and hot buttered scones, and dainty cakes and pastries and slices of rich fruit cake set out on tiered silver stands. The passengers settled into the comfortable chairs, and the ladies poured, and the talk ran on quietly, the gentle sociable talk of the afternoon, of the day's small doings, of the run the ship had made, of the fineness of the weather, of the people met, and the plans for the evening. And through it all, softly, the band played its tea music, light and pleasant airs suited to the hour, so that the whole scene had the warm, settled charm of a great country house drawing-room at tea-time, transported bodily out onto the sea. There was a particular sweetness in that hour, poised as it was between the freedom of the day and the splendour of the evening to come, a restful, unhurried, companionable hour, warm and easy and content. Outside, the afternoon light was failing over the grey water, and the air was turning cold. But within, in the bright snug room, among the palms and the flowers, with the tea steaming in the cups and the cakes upon the stands, and the music playing, and the pleasant murmur of talk all around, there was nothing but comfort and ease and quiet, good cheer. It was the small luxuries, quite as much as the great ones, that made the voyage what it was, the cup of tea brought just when it was wanted, the warm rug on the cold deck, the scone hot from the galley, and afternoon tea aboard that vessel, taken among friends in the soft light with the music playing, was one of the sweetest of them all, and was remembered by those who took it with a particular and lasting tenderness. It is worth pausing, amid all this splendour, to think a little about the age that had made such a ship, and had gathered such people aboard her, for she was not merely a marvellous vessel, she was the very symbol and summit of an age, and to understand her you must understand the age that built her. It was a confident time, that spring of 1912, perhaps the most confident that men have ever known, at least among the fortunate few who rode upon its crest. For the better part of a century the West had gone from strength to strength, in wealth, in science, in mastery over nature, until it seemed that there was nothing that human ingenuity could not accomplish, no difficulty it could not overcome, no comfort it could not provide. The age had harnessed steam and electricity, had spanned continents with railways and oceans with cables, had filled the cities with light and the homes of the rich with every luxury, and it had come to believe, deep down, that progress was the law of things, that matters would go on getting better and grander and safer forever, and that the reign of comfort and reason and plenty, at least for those who could pay, would never end. The ship was the perfect expression of that faith. She was the largest, the grandest, the most luxurious thing that had ever been made, a triumph of engineering and of art, and men spoke of her with a kind of awe, as the crowning achievement of the age, the proof of how far human skill had come. Aboard her, the wealthy of 2 continents lived for a week, in a comfort and a splendour that no king of former times could have commanded, waited on hand and foot, fed like emperors, warmed and lit and entertained and carried across the wild ocean without so much as a ruffle to disturb them. It seemed the very fulfilment of the age's dream, that man had grown so clever and so rich and so powerful that he could tame even the sea, could turn the most dangerous journey afloat into a floating garden party, could sit at his ease among the flowers and the music, while the deep Atlantic bore him gently home. There is, looking back, a golden light over that age and that year, the particular light of a long summer afternoon just before the evening comes, and we who know what followed cannot see it without a certain tenderness. For this was the last of the old world, the twilight of a long age of peace and confidence and grace, before the great storms of the century broke upon it, and the people aboard that ship, laughing over their wine, dancing to the music, dreaming their untroubled dreams of a future that would always be kind to them, were living in the last of the sunshine, in the final golden hours of a way of life that was passing, though they could not know it, forever. But we need not think of that tonight. Tonight the vessel is bright and snug and full of life. The age is at its zenith. The confidence is unbroken, and the assembled company sails on through the spring night in the happy certainty that the world is good and safe and theirs. Let us leave them in their happiness and go back among them, for the evening is not yet over. Among the passengers there was one sort in particular that gave a special sweetness to the voyage, and that was the young couples newly married, of whom there were a good many aboard, for it had become the fashion for the well-to-do to take their wedding journey upon one of the ocean liners, and what finer beginning to a married life could there be than a crossing on the most beautiful ship on earth? They were easy to pick out, these honeymooners, by the particular glow that hangs about the newlywed, the way they had of being wholly wrapped up in one another, of walking a little apart from the crowd, of catching each other's eye and smiling at some private happiness. And the older passengers watched them with an indulgent tenderness, remembering, perhaps, their own young days. For them the ship was a kind of enchanted palace built for their happiness alone. They walked the promenade decks together in the fresh sea air, arm in arm, wrapped up warm against the chill, talking of the life that lay before them. They took their coffee together in the Café Parisien among the ivy and the lamplight, heads bent close in the happy company of 2 that the newly married inhabit. They danced attendance on one another at dinner, and lingered in the lounge over the music, and walked out, when the night was fine, onto the open deck to stand together at the rail under the enormous sky, the young husband's coat about his bride's shoulders, and look out over the moonlit water, and feel themselves the most fortunate creatures that had ever lived. The whole splendour of the liner seemed arranged for their delight. The music played for them, the flowers bloomed for them, the engines throbbed to carry them toward the bright new life they were beginning together. There was something in it that touched everyone, this young love blossoming amid all the grandeur, for it was the one thing aboard more precious even than the diamonds and the gold. The plain, sweet happiness of the newly-wed at the very threshold of their marriage, setting out over the water toward all their hopes. The old couple, long married, saw in them their own beginning. The solitary travellers were warmed by the sight of them, and the entire ship seemed the gentler and the brighter for their presence. To see them walking the deck at evening, hand in hand, laughing with all the world before them and nothing but joy in their hearts, was to be reminded of what happiness looks like in its purest form, and it lent to the voyage, for all its luxury and fame, a note of simple human tenderness, the note of two hearts setting out together, full of hope, across the wide and shining sea. Thud. And what of the sea itself, and the crossing, the great fact that lay beneath all the pleasure and the splendour? For all her size and comfort, the ship was still a small thing upon a very great ocean, and her whole business was to carry her thousands across that immense and lonely waste of water. And it is worth remembering, amid the flowers and the music, just how far out upon the deep she was, and how utterly alone. Once she had left the last of the land behind, there was nothing around her, for days on end, but water, water to every horizon, a grey and rolling emptiness, stretching away 1,000 miles on every side, with no land, no other ship, nothing but the ceaseless heaving of the sea, and the great arch of the sky above it. And through this immensity the vessel drove on, day and night, a tiny warm point of light and life crawling across the cold face of the ocean. That spring the sea was kind to her. The weather held fair for the crossing, calm and clear and cold, with a flat and quiet sea and light winds, so that the vast vessel rode smooth and steady with scarcely a roll, and the passengers, even the poor sailors among them who had dreaded the crossing, found themselves untroubled and at ease. The days settled into their pleasant rhythm, each much like the last, and blended one into another in the timeless way of a voyage, so that a passenger soon lost all track of which day it was and cared not at all. And each day the ship made her steady run, her hundreds of miles of westing, eating up the immense distance to America, and the gentlemen made a little sport of it, wagering among themselves on how far she would travel between one noon and the next, and watching for the posting of the day's run with a keen and cheerful interest, and rejoicing when she made a good day's distance, for she was a fast ship as well as a grand one, and driving along handsomely. There was a deep and simple pleasure in that steady progress, in the sense of the distance being quietly and surely conquered, mile after mile, day after day, while the passengers did nothing at all but enjoy themselves. Somewhere ahead, growing a little nearer with every turn of the propellers, lay the new world, the towers of New York rising from the sea, the end of the voyage and the resumption of ordinary life. But that was still days away, and in no hurry to arrive, and in the meantime there was nothing to do but be borne along, in warmth and comfort and perfect safety, across the wide water. The ship throbbed on beneath them. The flat sea slid endlessly past. The fair weather held, and the warm floating palace, with all her happy company aboard, drove steadily westward through the calm, bright days and the cold, clear nights, alone upon the enormous ocean, carrying her thousands home. We have spent our evenings so far almost wholly among the rich and the celebrated, in the first-class splendour of the upper decks, for that was where the fame and the glamour lay. But it would be wrong to leave the vessel without remembering that she carried, that spring, 2 other whole worlds of people besides, in the decks below, and that their voyage, though humbler, was in its way as remarkable as that of the millionaires above. For below the first-class palace lay the second class, and below that the third, and even these, on this ship, were finer than many another vessel could offer to its very best. The second-class passengers were the comfortable middle folk of the age, the professors and the clergymen, the merchants and the schoolmasters, the tradespeople and the tourists, travelling in a comfort that on an older ship would have passed for luxury, good cabins, a handsome dining saloon, a library and a smoking room of their own, broad decks to walk upon, wholesome and plentiful food. They lacked the grand staircase and the Turkish baths and the à la carte splendour, but they wanted for nothing that mattered, and they crossed in a solid, comfortable respectability that suited them very well. Below them, in the third class, in what the sailors called the steerage, travelled the great mass of the humbler folk, and above all the emigrants, the men and women and children, leaving the old countries of Europe behind to seek a new life over the sea in America. And here, too, the ship was better than most, for the third class had proper cabins with beds, not the old open dormitories, and clean dining rooms, and decent food, and their own open deck, so that even the poorest aboard travelled in a decency that their grandparents could never have dreamed of. And it is worth pausing on those immigrants in the third class, for of all the people aboard, it was perhaps they who carried the greatest freight of hope. The millionaires above were merely going home, or going abroad, to more of the comfortable life they already knew. But these poorer folk in the decks below were sailing toward a wholly new beginning, leaving behind the villages and the small hard lives of the old countries, carrying everything they owned in a bundle or a battered trunk, going out to America, the golden land, to make new and better lives for themselves and their children. They gathered on their own deck in the fair weather, the young men and the shawled women and the wide-eyed children, talking in a dozen languages of the wonders that awaited them. And they too, in their way, were caught up in the adventure of the liner and the great hope of the crossing. Rich and poor, grand and humble, the ship bore them all together across the sea, each with their own dreams. And there was something fine in the thought of it, all those hopes and hearts, from the diamonds of the finest sweets to the bundles of the steerage, gathered into one vessel and borne westward together through the spring nights toward the new world and the future. Let us go back out on deck now, in the late afternoon, and watch the day end upon the ocean, for the fall of evening at sea was one of the loveliest sights of the entire voyage, and one the passengers gathered to see. As the sun went down toward the western horizon, toward the far-off America they were sailing to, the whole sky and sea were transformed. The sun grew huge and red, and sank slowly into the water at the very edge of the world, laying a broad road of gold and fire over the water straight toward the vessel, so that she seemed to be sailing up a path of light into the sunset. The clouds caught the colour and burned, rose and orange and deep purple, and the sea beneath went from grey to gold to a deep wine-dark blue as the light failed, and the air grew colder and cleaner and very still. And as the daylight drained away and the dusk came stealing over the water, the ship herself began to change, and to come into her full evening glory. One by one, then in their hundreds, the lights came on board her, warm and golden, in the portholes and the windows and along the decks, until the whole vessel blazed from end to end, a floating city of light riding upon the darkening sea. From the deck you could see the long rows of lit windows stretching away, the glow spilling out onto the water, the warm gold of her against the cold blue-black of the falling night. And if you could have stood off from her, out on the dark water, and looked back, you would have seen her as the only light in all that enormous darkness, a single blaze of warmth and life and beauty crawling across the black immensity of the sea, with the first stars coming out cold and sharp in the sky above her. It was a sight to catch at the heart, that transformation, the day dying in fire over the ocean and the liner kindling into light against the dusk, and the passengers, drawn to the rail to watch it, fell quiet before it, for all their gaiety, touched by the beauty and the strangeness and the vastness of it. Then the cold and the dark drove them in, back to the warmth and the light and the music, to dress for dinner and take up again the pleasant business of the evening, and the enormous vessel, ablaze now from stem to stern, drove on into the gathering night, a jewel of warmth and life set down in the middle of the wide sea, carrying her happy thousands on beneath the coming stars. Behind her the last of the sunset died in the west. Ahead lay the open ocean, and the long deep quiet of the night. By day, when the weather was fine, the open decks were a place of cheerful activity, for the passengers, having eaten so enormously, were glad of some way to stir their blood, and the vessel provided games of every kind out in the good salt air. There was space enough on those broad decks for all manner of sport, and the deck stewards would set out the gear and mark the courts, and the passengers, wrapped up warm against the sea wind, threw themselves into the games with all the energy of people on holiday. There was shuffleboard, in which you pushed weighted discs along the deck with a long queue, sliding them into the numbered squares chalked upon the planking, a game that looks simple, and is not, and that could rouse the mildest gentleman to fierce competition. There was the throwing of quoits, rings of rope tossed at a peg or a target, which the motion of the ship made pleasantly unpredictable. There were other games besides, races and contests and gentle athletic amusements, got up on the spur of the moment by parties of the younger and livelier sort. It was all very jolly, and very sociable, and half the pleasure of it was the company, for nothing draws people together like a game, and many an acquaintance that ripened into friendship over the following days began with a shared match of shuffleboard on the sunny deck. The players called and laughed and kept the score. The onlookers, snug in their deck chairs under their rugs, watched and cheered and offered their advice. And the whole scene had the happy, careless, healthy gaiety of a country house party at play, save that the lawn was a swaying deck, and the boundary was the rail, beyond which lay the endless heaving sea. The children ran and played their own games. The young people flirted over the quoits. The older folk took a turn at the shuffleboard and then retired, well pleased to their chairs and their bouillon. There was something wholesome and delightful in it, this play in the open air upon the deck of the vessel, with the cold, clean wind on your face and the sun on the water and the whole blue day around you, and nothing to do but enjoy yourself among pleasant people. It blew away the fumes of the rich food and the late nights. It filled the long hours with harmless fun. It knit the company together in good fellowship. And when a passenger had played his fill and grown pleasantly tired and cold, there was always the glowing interior to retreat into, the hot bath, the tea, the fireside corner of the lounge, so that the day aboard was a perfect alternation of brisk, fresh exercise and deep, warm comfort, of the open sea air and the cosy interior, each making the other the sweeter. It was, all in all, as healthy and happy and pleasant a way of passing the days as could well be imagined, out there in the middle of the shining sea. There was one part of the liner's business that the passengers scarcely thought of at all, and yet it was important enough to be written into her very name, for she was not merely a passenger liner, but a royal mail ship, and one of her great duties was the carrying of the mails over the ocean. Deep within her she held a sea post office, a proper post office afloat, where a small staff of postal clerks laboured, all the crossing long, at a task that most travellers never guessed was going on beneath their feet, the sorting of the mail. For the ship carried thousands upon thousands of bags of letters and parcels between Europe and America, hundreds of thousands of separate pieces, the whole correspondence of 2 continents entrusted to her, and it was the work of these clerks to sort it all, as the vessel steamed on, into its proper order and destination, so that the moment she docked in New York the mail could be got ashore, and on its way without an hour's delay. It was patient and unremarkable work, carried on in a plain room among the tiers of pigeonholes and the stacks of canvas sacks, far from the flowers and the music above. The clerks stood at their sorting frames hour after hour, reading the addresses and flicking the letters each into its place, working steadily through the mountains of mail while the ship bore them over the sea. And yet there was something rather wonderful in it when you stop to think that even the humble business of a letter, a note from a mother to a son, a lover's message, an order of goods, a piece of family news, was being carried across the whole width of the ocean in the belly of this floating palace, and sorted and made ready as it went, so that it might be delivered fresh and prompt on the far shore. The wealthy and the famous sailed above in splendour, but the vessel bore, too, the small private words of 10,000 ordinary people, and bore them faithfully across the sea. It was one more of the ship's many hidden labours, one more of the quiet, unseen tasks that went on ceaselessly beneath the pleasure of the passengers, and it spoke, like all the rest, of the extraordinary completeness of the thing, the way this single vast vessel gathered up so many purposes and so many worlds into herself, and carried them all together across the deep. She was a grand hotel and a floating palace, yes, but she was also a mail boat and a small town, and a mighty machine, and a haven of hope for the emigrants below all at once, and through her ran, day and night, 100 different streams of labour and of life, the cooks in the galley and the stokers at the fires, and the clerks at their sorting frames, and the officers on their bridge, all of them working together, unseen and unthanked, to carry the whole enterprise, in warmth and safety and comfort, over the wide and lonely sea. Come out with me now onto the open deck, late in the evening, when dinner is done and the cold has driven most of the company indoors, and let us stand a while at the rail in the black night, for the night at sea, on such a ship, was a thing of overwhelming beauty, and few who saw it ever forgot it. The moment you stepped out from the bright, warm interior, the cold met you, clean and sharp and bracing, the pure chill of the mid-ocean night, and the sound met you too, the rush and hiss of the liner driving through the water, the wind of her passage, and beneath it all the deep steady throb of the engines far below, felt through the soles of your feet. And then, as your eyes grew used to the dark, you looked up and caught your breath, for out there, far from any land, far from the smoke and the glare of any city, the sky at night was a thing that the land dweller can hardly imagine. The whole vast dome of the heavens blazed with stars, not the few faint points that we know ashore, but thousands upon thousands of them, from horizon to horizon, crowded and glittering and brilliant, hung in the black sky like a field of frost fire, and across the middle of them ran the great pale river of the Milky Way, a band of soft radiance spilling from one edge of the world to the other. There was no moon, perhaps, or only a thin one, and so the stars had it all to themselves, and they blazed down cold and pure and countless upon the night-heaving sea, and were answered, here and there, by a faint gleam upon the black water far below. It was so still, so vast, so silent and so grand, that it hushed you where you stood, and made you feel, all at once, both very small and strangely at peace. There is a particular feeling that comes upon a person standing alone at the rail of a ship at night, far out upon the ocean, under that enormous blaze of stars, and it is hard to put into words. It is a sense of the vastness of things, of the smallness of oneself, of the deep and ancient loneliness of the sea. And yet it is not a frightening feeling, but a strangely soothing one, a sense of being a tiny warm spark of life carried safely across an immensity too great to comprehend, held and warmed and borne along in the midst of all that cold enormity. Behind you was the warmth and the light and the music, the whole bright human world of the ship. Before you and above you was the dark and the silence and the endless stars, and you stood between the two, at the rail, in the crisp, clean night, and felt the wonder of it settle over you like a benediction. Then, chilled through and full of that strange, deep peace, you turned and went back in to the warmth and the light, carrying the stars and the silence with you into your dreams. And all this while, through the fair days and the starlit nights, the vessel was driving on, hard and steady and fast, for she was not only the grandest ship afloat but a swift one, and she went across the ocean at a pace that would have astonished the sailors of an earlier day. Down in the roaring stokeholds, the fires were kept at their fiercest, and the thundering engines turned at their full power, and the three mighty propellers, each the size of a windmill, churned the dark sea to a smother of white far astern, and the ship drove through the water with a deep, unhurried might, throwing a great curling bow wave aside from her sharp prow, and drawing behind her a long straight wake, a broad road of tumbled and glimmering water stretching away for miles behind, marking her passage across the trackless sea. To stand at the stern rail at night and watch that wake was a strange and stirring thing. There it went, streaming away from beneath you into the darkness, a pale turmoil of churned water, faintly luminous in the starlight, sometimes glittering with the cold green fire of the sea's own phosphorescence where the propellers had stirred it, and it ran back, dead straight toward the horizon and the east and the old world left behind, the visible track of the vessel's long journey through the night. Beneath your feet you could feel the deep drumming of the engines, the very heartbeat of the ship, steady and mighty and tireless, and you knew that far below, in the hot dark, the whole machine was labouring at its utmost to carry you on, that the fires roared and the pistons drove and the shafts spun and the propellers bit the sea, all so that this enormous weight of steel and luxury and human life might be flung forward through the water, hour after hour, mile after mile, toward the far shore. There was a grandeur in it, a sense of harnessed power almost beyond imagining, the greatest and most powerful thing that men had ever made, racing through the dark of the mid-ocean night, under the blaze of the stars, warm and bright and full of sleeping life, driving on toward America with the whole might of her engines. And there was, too, a deep reassurance in that steady, tireless throb, that sense of the immense machine working faithfully on through the night while you slept, for it meant that all was well, that the vessel was strong and swift and sure, that she was bearing you onward exactly as she should, and that you might give yourself up entirely to comfort and to rest, and leave the labour and the watching and the driving on to her, and to the tireless engines, and to the unseen men who tended them in the roaring dark below. I want you to feel now, before the evening ends, the particular quality of the happiness that filled that ship, for it was a happiness of a rare and complete kind, and it is worth dwelling on. The people aboard her were, for that week, as near to perfectly content as human beings are ever likely to be. Every care had been lifted from them. Every need was met before it was even felt. Every comfort that the age could devise was theirs for the asking. They had nothing to do, and nowhere to be, and no trouble to trouble them. They were warm and fed and waited upon and entertained and carried in perfect safety and perfect ease over the water. The hard edges of ordinary life, its labours and its worries and its small daily frictions had all fallen away, and there was left only pleasure and rest and the gentle passing of the golden hours. And there is a deep peace that comes with that kind of complete ease, a settling of the whole self, that most people taste only rarely in a lifetime. To wake in a soft bed with nothing that must be done, to breakfast at your leisure and drift up to a sunny deck, to lie wrapped in a rug in the sea air with a book you need not read, and doze, and watch the water, to be brought your bouillon and your tea exactly when you want them, to bathe and dress and go down to a dinner fit for a king, among pleasant company with music playing, and then to sink at last into a soft bed, rocked by the gentle motion of the ship, and slide into a dreamless sleep, knowing that tomorrow will bring only more of the same untroubled ease. This was the life of the passengers, day after golden day, and it wrapped them round in a contentment so deep and so complete that many of them said afterward that they had never in all their lives been so happy nor so much at peace. It is a rare gift, that to be given a stretch of pure untroubled happiness, a handful of golden days lifted clean out of the striving and the care of ordinary life, and the passengers knew it, and drank it in, and were grateful. They walked the decks and dined at the flowered tables and sat in the golden lounge among the music and the flowers, and felt themselves blessed above other people, carried through a charmed interval of perfect ease upon the most beautiful ship anywhere. And that deep contentment is the thing I would have you carry with you now, as our own evening draws on toward its close, that sense of perfect safety and perfect rest, of every care lifted and every comfort given, of being warm and held and borne gently onward, while all the labour and the watching is done by others, unseen in the black night. For it is very like the state we are drifting toward ourselves, you and I, as the night deepens and sleep draws near. Okay. Think for a moment of all that she was, the entire small world that she carried, for she was in truth a floating town, complete and self-contained, holding within her steel sides a whole society of human beings, more than 2,000 souls all told, cut off from all the rest of mankind by 100 miles of empty sea on every side, and carrying within herself everything that this little population could possibly need. She had her streets, which were the long carpeted corridors and the open decks. She had her grand houses, which were the finest suites, and her humbler dwellings in the decks below. She had her restaurants and her cafes, her library and her post office, her shops and her barber and her swimming bath, her hospital and her surgery with the liner's doctors ready for any who fell ill. She had her rulers, the captain and his officers, her craftsmen and her labourers, the engineers and the stokers, her servants, the great army of stewards, her tradesmen and her clerks and her musicians. She was a whole community, gathered up and set afloat, a little world unto herself upon the wide waters. And what a strange and varied population it was, this town upon the sea, and how many separate lives it held. In the fine suites above, the millionaires slept in their silk and gilt. Far below, in the third class, the emigrant families dreamed of America. Between them, the comfortable middle folk of the second class, and threaded all through the ship, unseen, the 1,000 members of her crew, each with his own place and his own task, from the grave captain on his bridge to the smallest page boy in the lift. Some of these lives touched, and some never met at all, though they were carried together in the same hull. The millionaire and the stoker breathed the same sea air in their separate spheres, a few decks apart, and neither knew the other's name. Yet all of them together made up the ship, this one hull that held them all and bore them all. The fortunate and the humble, the famous and the unknown, gathered into a single fellowship of the voyage, whether they willed it or knew it or not. There was something moving in the thought of it, this whole little world afloat, this gathered company of 2,000 human hearts, each with its own hopes and fears and loves and dreams, carried together through the vast, indifferent night upon the frail, warm island of the ship. Around them, on every side, lay the immense cold emptiness of the ocean and the sky, but within the vessel was warmth and light and human company, and every good thing, a little pocket of civilization and comfort and life borne bravely across the wilderness of the sea. and she brought them all, the whole 2,000 of them, safe and warm and together, on through the spring night toward the morning and the far shore, a whole town of the living, gathered under her lights, sailing on through the dark. But the evening is growing late now, and the great vessel is beginning slowly to quieten toward the night. In the dining saloon, the last of the diners have long since risen from the flowered tables, and the waiters have cleared away the silver and the crystal, and the huge room stands empty and dim. In the lounge, the company has thinned. The card players have played their last rubber and swept up the cards. The parties have broken up, one by one, with a last laugh and a good night, and drifted away toward their staterooms, and the musicians, who have played all evening, are packing away their instruments. At last, the final sweet strain of the final waltz dying away into the quiet. Here and there a few still linger, over a last cup of coffee, a last low conversation, reluctant to let the lovely evening go, but the room is emptying, and the lights are being turned a little lower, and the great gilded lounge is settling toward its rest. In the smoking room the men sit later, as men will, over their last cigars and their last glasses. The fire has burned low in the grate, and the blue smoke hangs in the still air, and the talk has grown quiet and drowsy and companionable. The voice is lower now, the great questions of the world settled for the night. One by one they knock out their pipes and drain their glasses and rise, stretching, and bid one another good night and go off to their beds, until only 2 or 3 are left, the confirmed night owls, deep in their leather chairs in the dim and smoky room, talking on in low voices while the ship drives through the night outside. And in the Café Parisien, the young people too have had their fill of gaiety at last, and the ivy-hung little room has grown quiet, the last of the young couples wandering off, hand in hand toward their rest, with the memory of a happy evening to carry into their dreams. All through the vast ship, the tide of the day is going out, the bright noise of the evening ebbing away into the deep hush of the night. The corridors, so lately full of the rustle of silk and the murmur of voices, are growing still. The stewards move softly now, turning down the beds, gathering the shoes left out to be cleaned, dimming the lights in the emptied rooms. The music has stopped. The laughter has died away. One by one the public rooms, the lounge and the smoking room and the reading room and the cafes, fall dark and silent and empty, their work done for the day. And the whole glowing social life of the liner, that had blazed so gaily through the evening, draws quietly in upon itself, and softens, and sinks, and prepares like the passengers themselves for sleep. Consider, as the ship quiets towards sleep, one small strange fact about her, the sheer weight of treasure that she carried, and that now lay resting in the dark along with her passengers. For the wealth aboard that ship was not only in the vast fortunes of her people, in their lands and their businesses and their bank accounts far away. A good part of it sailed with them, in solid and glittering form, in the shape of jewels. The ladies had brought their finest with them, as ladies did for a long crossing, and at dinner each evening the dining saloon and the lounge had blazed with them, diamonds at 100 throats, ropes of pearls, emeralds and rubies and sapphires, tiaras and necklaces and brooches and rings, the accumulated treasure of the oldest families made visible and worn, a king's ransom many times over glittering under the electric light. And now, as the evening ended and the ladies retired, all that treasure was put away for the night. Some of it went back into the jewel cases in the staterooms, tended by the maids, but the greatest pieces, the famous stones, the things of real and enormous value, were carried down to the purser's office near the foot of the grand staircase, there lodged for safe keeping in the strong safe, behind its heavy steel door, along with the rolls of banknotes and the gold and the important papers that the wealthy travelled with. So that deep in the heart of the vessel, in the dark locked office, there rested through the night a concentration of treasure such as few strong rooms on land could show, a glittering hoard of diamonds and pearls and gold, sleeping in the steel dark while their owners slept in their silken beds above. There is something almost dreamlike in the thought of it. All that cold fire of the gemstones lying quiet in the dark heart of the ship as she drove on through the night. All that fabulous wealth gathered into one small locked room far out upon the empty ocean. It is a measure of the strange richness of that floating world that it should carry casually, as a matter of course, a fortune in jewels to be locked away each night like so much ordinary luggage. But the jewels, for all their worth, were the least of what the vessel carried. The true treasure on board her was the living freight of human hearts, the 2,000 souls asleep and dreaming in her warm hull, each one worth more than all the diamonds in the purser's safe, and it was these, above all, that she bore so gently and so carefully on through the quiet night. Let us look in, very quietly, on the youngest travellers, for they are long asleep now, and there is no sweeter sight on all the ship. Behind one white door and another they lie, tucked up snug in their berths with the coverlet drawn to the chin, worn out and happy, sleeping the profound and total sleep that only the very young can sleep. Nurse has left a single lamp burning low, turned to the wall, so that there is just light enough to see by and not enough to wake a sleeper, and in that dimness the small faces are smoothed and solemn and utterly at rest, the flush of the day still on their cheeks, one arm flung out across the blanket, a rag doll or a wooden horse fallen from a loosened hand onto the floor beside the berth. They breathe slow and deep, and even all of them, in that unhurried rhythm that sleeping children keep, and the vessel takes up the rhythm and rocks them, ever so gently, as an enormous cradle rocks, lifting and settling and lifting again on the long, slow swell. The nurses and the nannies moved softly among them, drawing up a slipped blanket, soothing a child who stirred, keeping their quiet watch over the little ones, while the parents were still at their late pleasures or newly gone to bed. For the children the ship had been all day one great enchantment, a wonderland of marvels and kind faces and exciting discoveries, and they had given themselves to it wholly in the way of children, with no thought of anything but the delight of the moment. And now, worn out with delight, they slept the deep, untroubled sleep of the very young, dreaming perhaps of camels that rocked and pools that steamed, and the warm ship that bore them over the sea to the new place their parents spoke of. There is a peace that lies over sleeping children that touches even the hardest heart, and that peace lay now over all the small ones aboard the vessel, the rich child in the fine suite, and the emigrant child in the third-class berth alike, all of them equally innocent, equally trusting, equally safe in the warm dark of the sleeping ship. They knew nothing of fortunes or fame, of first class or third. They knew only that they were warm, and fed, and loved, and rocked, and that the great kind ship was carrying them gently on through the night toward the morning. And she carried them tenderly, all her sleeping children, the whole precious freight of them, on through the quiet dark, and there is no better image, perhaps, of the deep peace of that night aboard her than a child asleep in a snug berth, rocked by the sea, dreaming happy dreams, while the vast vessel bore him safely on. It is a comfort, on any long voyage, to know that if anything should go amiss, there is help at hand. And on this ship, as in all things, that help was of the very best, for she carried her own hospital, a proper little infirmary with clean, bright wards and beds, and her own surgeons, skilled medical men who sailed with her to care for the health of all aboard, passengers and crew alike, through the whole of the crossing. It was a reassurance that the passengers seldom had cause to call upon, but were glad, in the back of their minds, to know was there. For the sea is a lonely place, far from the doctors and the hospitals of the land, and it eased the heart to know that a ship this great had thought of that too and provided against it, as she had provided against every other want. Most of the surgeon's work on such a voyage was of the gentlest and most ordinary kind. There was the seasickness, of course, the common affliction of the crossing, though the fair weather that spring spared most of the passengers its miseries. There were the small ailments that any gathering of 2,000 people will produce: a child's fever, an old gentleman's cough, a turned ankle from the deck games, a headache, a chill. The doctors went their quiet rounds and dispensed their remedies, and sat by a sick child's birth and set the anxious mothers' minds at rest. And their very presence, calm and competent and kind, was itself a kind of medicine, a sign that here, as everywhere on the ship, a person was watched over and cared for and safe. And it was one more thread in the web of care that held the whole floating world together, one more of the countless ways in which the vessel looked after her people. From the captain on the bridge watching over the safety of all, to the surgeon at the sick child's bedside, to the steward answering the midnight bell, to the stoker feeding the fires that kept the ship warm, the great vessel was, from end to end, an engine of care, an immense and intricate machine, whose whole purpose was the comfort and the safety and the well-being of the souls on board her. And the passengers felt it, that web of care all around them, though they seldom stopped to trace it. They felt themselves held and tended and safe, and it was a good part of the deep contentment of the voyage, that sense of being so completely looked after, so that a person might lay down every care and simply rest, like a child in a well-run house, trusting entirely to the kind and capable hands that governed all. Even now, in the deep of the night, when the passengers were nearly all abed, the liner did not wholly sleep, for a small band of stewards kept their watch through the small hours, so that no traveller, waking in the black night, need ever want for anything. Here and there along the quiet corridors a night steward sat or softly walked, ready at any hour to answer a bell, for the bells could ring at any time, and often did, and were always answered. A passenger lying wakeful in the dark, unable to sleep, had only to press the button by his bed, and within a minute there would come a soft knock at the door, and a quiet voice asking how he might be of service, and what small kindnesses those night stewards did, in the deep of the night, unrecorded and unremembered. They brought a glass of warm milk, or a pot of tea, to a passenger who could not sleep. They fetched a book, or a headache powder, or an extra blanket against the cold. They soothed a nervous traveller, frightened by the strangeness of the sea. They tended a fretful child, so that its weary mother might rest. They went softly about the darkened ship on 100 tiny errands of comfort, so that even in the loneliest hour of the night, far out upon the black ocean, no soul aboard was ever truly alone or unattended. It was service of a kind that has almost vanished from the world, quiet and constant and complete, the service of people whose whole art and pride was in the care of others, and who took a real and gentle satisfaction in it. There was a deep comfort in that, though most of the passengers slept too soundly to know it. The knowledge, felt rather than thought, that even as you slept, someone was awake and watching, ready to come at your call, that the ship was tended through the night by kind and waking hands. It is one of the oldest and deepest of human comforts, that to sleep in safety while another keeps watch, and the passengers of that liner had it in its fullest measure, wrapped around in care from the captain on his bridge to the night steward in his quiet corridor, so that they might give themselves up wholly to sleep and rest as deeply and as trustingly as children in a nursery, while all around them, unseen, the faithful watch was kept, and the vessel brought them on, warm and tended and safe, through the long, quiet reaches of the night. And now at last it is time for our company to go to their rest, and one by one, and two by two, they make their way to bed. Down the long, warm corridors they go, the last of the lingerers. The men from the smoking room with the smell of cigars still about them, the couples from the emptying cafes, the night owls who have talked away the small hours, along the softly lit passages, past the rows of white doors with their little brass numbers, with a murmured good night here and a smile there, to their own doors and their own snug rooms. The stewards have been before them, the beds are turned down, the lamps lit low, the rooms warm and waiting, and gratefully, at the end of the long, delightful day, they close their doors upon the corridor and the vessel and the sea, and give themselves up to the last and sweetest luxury of all, which is sleep. In the snug staterooms the maids and the valets do their last quiet offices, and are dismissed for the night. The gowns are hung away, the jewels put by, the studs and the pins laid on the dressing table. And then the passengers in their soft night clothes climb into the wide, comfortable beds, between the cool sheets, and lie back upon the pillows, and feel the gentle motion of the ship beneath them, and the deep faint throb of her engines far below, steady as a heartbeat. Perhaps they read a page or two by the low light. Perhaps they lie and think over the pleasures of the day, the good dinner, the music, the fine company, the beauty of the vessel. Perhaps they simply close their eyes and let the tiredness take them, and the immense vessel rocks them ever so gently in her enormous arms, and the engines throb their lullaby, and one by one the little reading lamps go out along the corridors, and the passengers slip down into sleep. Room by room, deck by deck, the lights go out, and the ship settles into the deep stillness of the night. The fine public rooms stand dark and empty now. The lounge and the smoking room and the dining saloon, their gaieties all ended, waiting quietly for the morning. The corridors are hushed and dim. In 1,000 beds the passengers lie sleeping, the millionaire and the emigrant, the old couple and the young lovers, the children in their berths, all of them wrapped in the same snug dark, all of them rocked by the same gentle sea, all of them carried together, sleeping, on through the night. The ship has gathered all her people in, and hushed them, and laid them down to rest, and now she alone is awake, driving on through the night, keeping her sleeping thousands safe. On a clear night late, when the liner was quiet, the moon would sometimes climb up out of the sea behind her and lay its own enchantment over the water. It rose slowly at the edge of the world, enormous and pale gold at first, then smaller and whiter as it lifted into the sky, and it threw down upon the sea a long broad path of silver light, a shimmering road that ran across the night water straight to the ship and travelled with her wherever she went. The waves caught the light and broke it into 1,000 moving glints. The wake glimmered, and the whole enormous plain of the ocean that had been so black, softened now to a great expanse of silver and shadow, rolling gently away to the pale horizon on every side. In that light the vessel herself was transfigured. Her decks lay washed in a soft grey radiance, her funnels and masts threw long moon shadows across the planking, her wake ran back into the silver distance like a track of light. The few who were still abroad on the deck to see it, a wakeful passenger, a courting couple loath to go in, an officer pacing his watch, fell silent before the beauty of it, the great moonlit sea, and the silver ship gliding through it, so still and so grand and so strange. There was no sound but the wash of the water along her side, and the sighing of the wind, and over it all the moon poured down its cool and tender light, and the ship swam on through, a world turned all to silver. It was one of those sights that a person carries to the end of their days, the memory of the moon on the mid-ocean at night, seen from the deck of a liner, in a moment of perfect peace. There was a magic in it beyond words, a beauty so pure and so vast and so quiet that it seemed to still the very heart, and it spoke, somehow, of things far larger than the little bright human world of the ship, of the slow turning of the heavens, and the ancient patience of the sea, of a peace older and deeper than anything that men had made. And then the cold would send the last watchers in, and the deck would lie empty under the moon, the silver light washing over the bare planking, and the ship glided on alone through the shining night, beautiful and untroubled, bearing her sleeping thousands over the moonlit sea. And so the night went on, and the quiet hours passed, one after another, over the sleeping ship. Time did not stop, out there on the ocean, though the passengers slept. The liner kept her own time, faithfully, through all the reaches of the night. High on the bridge, the officers stood their watches and were relieved in their turn, one coming up into the cold and the dark as another went thankfully down, so that always, at every hour, there were waking eyes upon the sea ahead and a steady hand upon the ship, and the vessel's bell marked the passing of the time, the way it had been marked at sea for centuries, sounded softly through the small hours, telling over the watches of the night to any who lay awake to hear it, a small clear sound out of the old traditions of the sea, floating away over the dark water. Below, in the empty stairwell, the beautiful carved clock upon the landing ticked quietly on, its bronze figures keeping their patient watch over the deserted staircase, the hands creeping round through the silent hours, from midnight on toward the dawn, while no one passed to read them. In the dark public rooms the furniture stood still and ghostly. In the corridors the low lights burned, and everywhere the deep, faint throb of the engines went on, steady and unwearied, the pulse of the ship beating on through the night. Overhead, unseen by the sleepers, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky, the whole glittering dome of them turning westward through the night as it had turned since the beginning of the world, and the vessel crept on beneath them, a tiny moving point of light, following her course across the face of the deep. There is a peculiar quality to the deep middle of the night at sea, the small hours when the world sleeps, and only a few keep waking, and the ship seemed then most truly herself, most alone, most quietly magnificent. All the gaiety and the glitter of the evening were gone, folded away. The passengers slept, and the liner drove on through the dark, tended by her handful of waking watchers, carrying her freight of dreaming souls steadily toward the morning. Hour followed hour. The watches changed. The bell told them over. The clock ticked in the empty stairwell. The stars turned, and slowly, imperceptibly, far ahead beyond the horizon, the night wore on toward its end, and the unseen miles fell away behind, and the ship drew ever nearer, through the quiet dark, to the new day and the far shore. And where was she going all this while, this vessel driving on so faithfully through the night? She was going home, or rather she was carrying her people home, and toward new beginnings, westward across the sea, toward the new continent rising beyond the sea line, and somewhere ahead of her, still far off but drawing nearer with every hour, lay the end of the voyage and the goal of it all. In a few more days the passengers knew they would wake one morning to find the open sea narrowing, and land birds about the vessel, and then, at last, low on the western horizon, the first faint smudge of the coast of America, and then the ship would come in from the sea, past the low green shores, up the broad bay, toward the greatest city of the New World. They pictured it, some of them, as they drifted towards sleep, the arrival, the end of the crossing. They saw, in their mind's eye, the towers of New York rising from the water ahead, the famous skyline of the new age, taller than any city on earth, glittering in the morning light, the great harbour crowded with shipping, the tugs coming out to meet them, the crowds waiting on the pier, the families and the friends, scanning the rail for a beloved face. For the emigrants below it was the promised land itself drawing near, the land of hope and of new lives, toward which they had staked everything. For the wealthy above it was home, and the resumption of their great affairs. For the young couples, it was the threshold of the life they would build together. All of them, in their different ways, were sailing toward their future, toward the bright morning of arrival that lay somewhere ahead beyond the nights of the crossing. But that was still to come, still a few days off, and in no hurry, and tonight there was only the sailing on, the steady, faithful driving on through the night, carrying all those hopes and dreams and futures gently toward their fulfillment. The ship knew her course, and held it. The engines never faltered. And mile by mile, hour by hour, through the quiet nights and the fair days, she bore her thousands westward toward the morning and the shore. There is a deep comfort in that, in being carried surely toward a good destination while you rest, in knowing that the journey goes faithfully on even as you sleep, and that you will wake nearer to your desire than when you closed your eyes. And so the passengers slept, and dreamed, perhaps, of the bright shore ahead, and the great vessel bore them on through the dark toward the morning, faithful and tireless and sure, bearing them home. There is almost always, on such a night, one who cannot quite bear to go in, one last soul lingering on deck when all the rest have sought their beds, and let us keep them company for a moment before we too seek our rest. Perhaps it is an older traveller, one who has crossed the sea many times and knows how few such perfect nights there are. Perhaps a young one, too full of the wonder of it all to sleep. Or only someone wakeful, who has slipped out from a warm cabin to stand a while in the cold and the dark and the quiet. Whoever it is, they stand alone now at the rail, wrapped warm against the chill, with the sleeping ship behind them and the great night sea before them, and they are entirely at peace. They are not lonely, this last watcher, though they are alone, for there is a companionship in the night and the sea and the stars, in the great quiet beauty of the world, that fills the heart more than any human talk. They stand and breathe the clean night air, and feel the vessel alive and steady beneath them, and look out over the dark water at the faint far line where the sea meets the sky, and let their thoughts drift where they will, gently, without hurry, in the deep calm of the small hours. All the day's brightness and bustle has fallen away. All the striving of ordinary life seems very far off. There is only this, the ship and the sea and the stars and the quiet, and the deep sweet peace of being awake and alone with the beauty of the night while all the world sleeps. And then, at last, the chill or the tiredness gently turns them in, and they take one last long look at the sea and the sky, storing the beauty of it away in the heart to keep and turn, and go softly back into the warmth. The door closes behind them, the deck lies empty, and the last of the wakeful passengers goes down through the quiet ship to bed, carrying the peace of the night in with them. Now the vast vessel is given over wholly to sleep and to the black night. Her decks are bare, her rooms are still, her people are all abed at last, and she drives on alone through the night, bright and snug and silent, with none awake aboard her now, but the faithful few who keep her, and the stars turning overhead, and the wide sea rolling quietly by. Let us go through her one last time, softly, now that she sleeps, and see her whole. Come up first to the topmost decks, where the cold, clean wind blows over the empty planking, and the deck chairs stand folded and stacked for the night. Here, high up, the gymnasium is dark and still, its clever machines at rest, and the funnels rise black against the blaze of stars breathing their faint warm breath into the night. Come down a deck, to the grand public rooms, the lounge, where a few hours ago the music played and the diamonds flashed, standing dim and silent now, the chairs empty, the flowers breathing in the dark, the smoking room, where the last cigar has long gone out and the fire is grey ash, the reading room, its writing tables bare, its books shut upon their shelves. All the bright rooms of the evening lie quiet and deserted, holding the ghost of the day's gaiety in the stillness. Come down again, past the staircase, where the dome glows faintly over the deserted steps, and the carved clock ticks alone on its landing, down through the decks of staterooms where behind every white door a traveller lies sleeping. Here they all are, the company of them, wrapped in the warm dark. The financier asleep in his silken suite, the old couple sleeping side by side as they have slept for 40 years, the young lovers, the countess, the famous and the humble, the maid in her narrow berth, and her mistress in her fine one, all of them stilled and quiet and at peace. Down further to the second class and the third, where the emigrants sleep and dream of America, down to where the servants rest and the off-duty crew, a whole town of the sleeping deck below deck wrapped in one warm hush. And down at the very bottom of her, in the hot roaring dark that never sleeps, the fires still burn and the black gang still labours, feeding the furnaces watch by watch through the night, and the engines still turn, mighty and tireless, driving her on. And high above on the cold bright bridge the officer stands his watch, and the man at the wheel holds her true, and the liner drives on through the night. So there she is, all of her, this little world afloat, her thousands sleeping in her warm heart, her fires burning in her depths, her watchers waking on her bridge, her engines beating on, and all around her the immense and starlit night and the dark rolling sea. She holds them all, and keeps them all, and carries them all, safe and snug and dreaming, on through the quiet hours toward the morning, the most beautiful ship anywhere, sailing on through the spring night, with all her people gathered sleeping in her arms. Now it is time for you to join them, to let go of the day entirely, and to slip away into that same deep and peaceful rest. So let yourself sink down, now, as the passengers sank down into their soft beds, and let the warmth gather around you, and let every last thread of the day go slack and loose and easy. There is nothing left for you to do tonight. There is nowhere you must be. Like the vessel, you may give yourself over wholly to the night, and let yourself be carried, gently and safely toward the morning. Let your mind drift, if it wishes, back through the bright warm world we have wandered tonight, not to hold on to any of it, but only to let it carry you down into slumber. Let yourself sink into a soft wide bed in a warm panelled room, with the low light glowing and the fresh flowers breathing in the dark, and feel beneath you the great vessel rocking you ever so gently in her enormous arms. Feel the deep faint throb of her far below, steady as a heartbeat, steady as your own slow breathing now. Here, very far off, the last soft strain of the music dying away down the empty corridors. See, as your thoughts loosen and blur, the sweeping staircase glowing quietly under its dome, and the moon laying its silver path across the wide dark sea, and the stars turning slowly overhead, and let all of it soften and fade and drift away as the ship carries you down and down into the snug dark of rest. If some night you should wish to slip away again, to some other far place, some other quiet corner of the past, then come and find me, and I will gladly take you there, for there will always be another evening like this one waiting, whenever the day has been too much, or sleep is slow in coming, or you simply wish to travel somewhere far away for a while. But that is for another night. Tonight, there is only rest. The evening we have spent together is over now, and there is nothing left but rest, and the gentle rocking of the sea, and the quiet all around you. The enormous liner sails on through the night, and all her people are sleeping, and now you are among them, snug and safe and carried gently on. Let your breathing go slow and deep. Let the last of the light fade. Let yourself drift down and down into the soft and welcoming dark, rocked by the sea, borne quietly onward toward the morning. Sleep now. Sleep well. Stay warm. Be kind to the people in your house. And I will see you in the next one. Good night.